Hey you! Yes, you wrapped up and settled in for the night. Come a little closer. I have been waiting to tell you this one. Almost 2,000 years ago, a Roman emperor sat down to the strangest dinner in the ancient world. A silver plate wide as a table. Inside it, the brains of peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, fish organs carried in by warships from across the whole empire. Just to season one single meal, he called it the shield of the goddess. Less than a year later, his own people dragged him through the streets of Rome and threw what was left of him into a river. Tonight we sit down at that table, and we find out why. But before we step into that room together, I want to ask you for something small. If stories like this one are the kind that help you drift off, or just make a quiet evening feel a little less lonely, it would mean more than you know if you tapped that like button, or stayed a while longer by following along for what comes next. A comment helps too, even a short one. Tell me where you are tonight and what time it is on your end. I go through every single one, even the smallest hello. Now go on, turn the lights down low if you have not already. Let a fan hum somewhere nearby, or crack a window and let the night air find its way in. Get comfortable and settle in. Let's begin. Picture Rome for a moment the way it must have looked back then. Marble columns catching the last orange light of evening. Smoke curling up from 1,000 cooking fires across the city. The distant murmur of the forum voices layered over each other like waves. Somewhere beneath all of that noise and beauty, though the whole empire was quietly falling apart one broken promise at a time. And into that fragile, glittering city walked a man the history books would remember for exactly one thing: his appetite. In one single wrecked year, Rome went through 4 different emperors. Historians simply call it the year of the 4 emperors, because there is honestly no gentler way to say it. One ruler was murdered by his own guards. Another took his own life rather than be captured. And somewhere in the middle of all the chaos walked a heavy, easygoing man named Vitellius, a man almost nobody in Rome ever expected to sit on a throne. By most accounts, he was hard to miss in a crowd. Unusually tall, a face often flushed red from wine, a wide, soft belly that arrived in every room slightly before he did. One leg dragged just a little, an old injury from a chariot accident years before. He did not look like a soldier. He did not act like one either. There's even a story that when Vitellius was born, his own horoscope frightened his parents so badly that his father tried to block his early career completely, terrified of what the stars seemed to be promising his son. Rome loved a good omen. This one, it turns out, was not wrong. It was simply pointed in a direction nobody in that room expected. Which is exactly why the emperor before him sent Vitellius off to a cold, distant outpost called Lower Germany along the Rhine River. That emperor, a man named Galba, believed Vitellius was simply too lazy and far too fond of his own dinner table to ever become a threat to anyone. He was wrong. The soldiers stationed with Vitellius did not follow him because he was clever or fierce or brilliant in battle. They followed him because he was warm, generous, the kind of commander who said yes far more often than he said no, and who treated his men like old friends rather than tools. When the fighting far away in Rome finally settled and the throne sat empty once again, those same soldiers lifted Vitellius onto their shoulders quite literally and carried him all the way toward the capital. Every emperor before him had used food to show a little power. That was simply what being Roman and being rich looked like back then. Wealth dressed up and served on a plate. But Vitellius took that idea somewhere else completely. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing not long after these events, said Vitellius sat down to 3, sometimes 4, full banquets in a single day. And in the empty hours between his own meals he accepted invitations to other people's feasts as well, simply so he would not have to go without. He's even said to have reached past priests to grab meat set aside for the gods, food meant for sacrifice, not supper. He's said to have stopped his own carriage in the middle of a busy street, just to snatch a warm snack off a food seller's cart. A man with the wealth of an entire empire sitting behind him, stealing lunch off a stranger's stall. There is something almost funny about that, honestly. Almost sweet even in a strange way, until you remember exactly where this particular appetite of his was headed. Because somewhere in the middle of his short reign, Vitellius decided the moment called for something bigger than a banquet. He commissioned a dish, not really a meal if we're honest with each other, more like a monument you could eat with a spoon, a platter of solid silver, so wide that the writers who saw it struggled to find the right words for its size. And onto that silver piled together in one place sat a strange little parade of ingredients that had absolutely no good reason to share a single plate. The livers of pike streaked through with red and yellow, the soft brains of pheasants and of peacocks, the delicate tongues of flamingos pink and strange against all that silver, the pale, tender organs of lampreys, a fish most ordinary Romans would never see with their own eyes in an entire lifetime. None of it came from anywhere nearby either. Vitellius sent his ships out across the whole known world just to gather it. Warships built and armed for battle redirected instead toward fetching fish organs and bird tongues for one single afternoon. Some sailed east all the way to Parthia, near what we now call Iran. Others sailed west toward the narrow strait separating Spain from the coast of Africa. Once everything was finally gathered, cleaned, and carefully arranged, Vitellius gave his creation a name to match its size. He called it the Shield of Minerva. Minerva, protector of Rome, goddess of war wisdom and craft all at once. A small sly joke really dressed up as an offering to the gods. Only this particular shield would never block a single blow from an enemy. It was built purely to be admired and then quite happily eaten. The historian Tacitus later wrote that Vitellius burned through 900 million sesterces in only a short stretch of time as emperor. Sit with that number for just a second. An ordinary Roman soldier risking his life out on some cold, muddy frontier might earn a few hundred sesterces across an entire year of service. What rested on that one silver plate could have paid the wages of a whole army, for far longer than most of those soldiers would ever serve in a lifetime. Now hold that number gently for a moment, because a few streets away from the palace on that very same night, a very different kind of dinner was probably happening. A soldier's family may be gathered around a low table, a bowl of thick wheat porridge, bread torn by hand rather than sliced, watered down wine a little sour because that is simply what most people could afford. No flamingo tongues waited for them, no warships had sailed anywhere on their behalf. Just bread and porridge and each other in a small room somewhere far from the marble and the torchlight. Two very different tables under the very same Roman sky on the very same night. We will come back to that second table soon. But first let's finish this one. Picture the room itself that night. Torches lining every wall, throwing soft gold light across marble floors. Guests reclining on couches dressed in their finest, perfumed murmuring among themselves, as the great doors swung open and 4 servants carried in something far too large for any ordinary table. Firelight rolled across the silver as it moved, throwing bright shifting light over every face turned to watch it pass. The smell must have reached the room before the plate even did. Salt water and distant seas, and something rich enough to make even the wealthiest guests lean forward in their seats without quite meaning to. Somewhere near the back of the room a few senators traded glances instead of words. The particular kind of glance people share when they feel impressed and uneasy at exactly the same moment. Beneath all that silver and spectacle, real fish had died in far-off waters. Real birds had lost their tongues and their small clever brains, all so one heavy easygoing man could announce, without saying a single word out loud, that nothing left in the known world was out of his reach. But here is the part almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. While that shield gleamed under torchlight inside the palace, out past the edges of the city, entire legions stationed in the east had already begun turning away from Vitellius completely. Another general, a steady, battle-hardened man named Vespasian, was quietly gathering support of his own far from Rome, far from silver plates and flamingo tongues. Vitellius's grip on the empire was already slipping through his fingers. even as he sat there feasting like a man who believed he owned forever. It took less than a year for it all to fall apart. His own soldiers began slipping away from him, one small group at a time. The very city that had cheered his arrival now turned cold, then hostile. When Vespasian's forces finally reached Rome, Vitellius tried quietly to hand back the crown on his own terms. His own guards would not allow it. They forced him back into the palace instead. In the end, he was found hiding inside a gatekeeper's small lodge, not some grand palace chamber. He'd stripped off his imperial robes and pulled on ordinary ragged clothing, trying his best to disappear into an ordinary crowd. Somewhere in those borrowed clothes, historians say a handful of gold coins were still tucked away out of pure habit, even in that final desperate hour. Old habits, it seems, rarely vanish just because everything else already has. It did not work. His own people found him anyway. They tied his arms behind his back, tore what was left of his fine clothing, and pulled him out into the open street, forcing him again and again to lift his face so he could watch his own statues toppling to the ground around him. They marched him past the very spot where the emperor before him had once fallen. Eventually they brought him to the Gemonian stairs, a stone stairway used for public executions, and there, in front of a crowd that had once cheered his name through these same streets, his final words were simple. "Yet I was once your emperor." Afterward his body was hooked and dragged through the streets one final time, all the way down to the river Tiber, the very same river that had once carried lampreys and rare fish organs toward his silver plate. And into that water they let him go. So here is a small, quiet thought worth sitting with for a moment before we move any further tonight. The shield of Minerva was built to prove that one man was untouchable. Instead, it became one of the clearest warnings history ever quietly wrote down for the rest of us. Power built only on spectacle, it turns out rarely lasts nearly as long as it believes it will. And somehow that is a strangely comforting thought to carry into a quiet night. Because it means the things we build only to be admired rarely outlast the things we build with care. Somewhere between the silver and the flamingo tongues and the warships sent out just for one dinner, the people of Rome had already stopped seeing Vitellius as their emperor. They'd started seeing him as a joke wearing a crown. Food, it turns out, was never simply food in ancient Rome. It was a kind of language. A quiet, edible way of saying who mattered and who did not without ever needing to speak a single word out loud. But if a shield made of bird brains and fish organs sat at the very top of that language, then somewhere far below it, at the very bottom, there was a much smaller, much quieter table. No silver, no warships crossing the sea for one flamingo's tongue, just a bowl, a spoon, and a question almost nobody ever stops to actually ask. What did an ordinary Roman family eat on an ordinary night long before anyone ever dreamed up a shield made out of dinner? Let's go find out. Here is the strange part. To answer that question honestly, we cannot start with the food itself. Not yet. Because long before anyone in Rome decided what to put on a table, they had already decided something else entirely. How a person was even allowed to sit down and eat it. And once you understand that one small rule, a lot of Roman life suddenly makes a great deal more sense. Picture for a moment a regular apartment building in the city of Rome itself, not a country villa, not a senator's mansion, just an ordinary block of rented rooms stacked 5 or 6 stories high, called an insula. Most residents of Rome made their homes somewhere like this, packed shoulder to shoulder, sharing thin walls and thinner floors. Here is something that tends to surprise people. Many of these apartments had no kitchen at all. None. Landlords considered open cooking fires far too dangerous in a wooden building stacked 6 stories into the sky, and honestly, they were right to worry. Rome burned down more than once because somebody's dinner got out of hand. So what did families do instead? They walked downstairs out onto the street corner and bought dinner from a counter, built directly into the wall of the building. A long marble slab with wide clay pots sunk into it, keeping soups and stews warm all day. We would probably call it fast food today. The Romans called it a thermopolium, and if you ever travel to Pompeii you can still walk up to one right now paint, and all standing exactly where its last customer left it. You can even see the faded paintings still decorating some of these counters, a rooster here, a dog there, the ancient version of a hand-painted sign trying to catch a hungry passerby's eye. Now if you happen to have money, real money, your evening looked completely different. You owned or borrowed for the night a proper dining room called a triclinium. The name comes from the Greek for 3 couches, and that is exactly what it held. 3 low couches arranged in a U-shape around a small central table, with the 4th side left open so the household slaves could move in and out freely, refilling cups and clearing plates without ever stepping over a guest's legs. You did not sit at this table. You reclined on your left elbow propped against a cushion, eating with your right hand, a habit the Romans had happily borrowed from the Greeks generations earlier. Some of the wealthiest homes even decorated their dining room floors with tiny stone mosaics designed to look like the leftover mess of a finished meal. Fish bones, olive pits, a stray grape or two scattered across the tiles as though a feast had just ended. It was considered clever art. A permanent stone version of a good time laid right there under everyone's sandals. There was a small ritual before any of that too easy to miss if you were only picturing food. Arriving guests were often greeted with a basin of water for their travel-worn feet and asked to trade their outdoor shoes for soft house sandals at the door, a simple way of keeping the dirt of the street out of somebody else's home. Many households paused just briefly at a small shrine near the entrance called the lararium, giving quiet thanks to the spirits believed to watch over that particular family before anyone sat down to eat a single bite. It was less about religion in any grand sense, and more like something we might recognize instantly. A family taking one small breath together before the evening truly begins. Where you were placed on those 3 couches said almost everything about your standing in the room. The middle couch held the seat of honor reserved for the guest a host most wanted to impress. Lean too far toward the door, and everyone at the table understood exactly how much you mattered, which was not very much. Even the guest list followed its own quiet rule. One old Roman saying held that a proper dinner party should never have fewer guests than the Graces and never more than the Muses, which meant in plain terms somewhere between 3 people and 9. Any fewer felt lonely. Any more and somebody was bound to end up talking over somebody else. And here is a small detail I happen to love. Guests were sometimes allowed to bring along a friend who had not technically been invited at all. Romans had a name for this uninvited +1. They called him a shadow. Polite hosts tolerated him. Everyone else quietly judged him. Do you have a friend like that, the one who somehow shows up at every gathering, invited or not? Apparently some things about people have not changed in 2,000 years. One more detail worth knowing, especially since a good portion of you listening tonight are exactly the audience Roman moralists worried about most. In the earliest days of the Republic, women were often kept away from these reclining dinners, altogether expected to sit upright in a chair nearby rather than share a couch. That changed over time. By the height of the empire, women in many households reclined right alongside the men, drank the same wine and joined the same conversation, a shift plenty of old-fashioned writers complained about loudly, and just as loudly lost the argument over. Now here is where things get a little strange for modern ears. If a Roman host invited you to dinner, you would not be showing up at 8 in the evening the way we might today. You would already have eaten twice by then, and probably gone to bed. The Roman day began with a light breakfast called intaculum, usually just bread, maybe dipped in wine or honey eaten, standing up before anyone left the house. Around mid-morning came a small second meal prandium, often nothing more than yesterday's leftovers eaten quickly and without much ceremony. The real meal, the cena, the one worth dressing for, began in the early afternoon right after a trip to the public baths to wash off the day. Have you ever tried planning your whole evening around sunlight instead of a clock that was simply daily life in Rome? There was no reliable way to light a room once night fell, so if a host wanted guests who were awake steady and able to actually see their food, he fed them while the sun still worked in his favour. Only the most notorious eaters in Roman history, the names that still come up whenever historians want to talk about excess, were known for sitting down to their main meal at noon, treating dinner less like a daily need and more like a performance that never really ended. Once seated and properly comfortable, the meal itself followed a shape that would feel oddly familiar to a lot of modern restaurants. First came the gustatio, a light opening course meant to wake up the appetite. Eggs, olives, raw vegetables, maybe a few shellfish, often paired with a honeyed wine called mulsum, which functioned more or less like a Roman cocktail hour. Next came the real heart of the evening course, after course of roasted meats, fish, and rich sauces, carried in on small individual tables so elaborate that wealthier hosts sometimes swapped them out between every single dish, each course announced almost like its own small performance. And finally, once appetites had softened, came the secunda mensa, a lighter closing course of fruit nuts and honeyed sweets, eggs to open, fruit to finish. The Romans noticed this pattern so often that they turned it into a saying, ab ovo usque ad mala, from the egg all the way to the apples, meaning simply, from beginning to end. It is the exact same idea English speakers still reach for today when we say a meal went from soup to nuts. Is it not strange how a 2,000-year-old dinner table can still leave fingerprints on the language we use every single day, and most of us never even notice? Here is another detail worth sitting with. Nobody at that table was using a fork. Individual table forks, the kind we use without a second thought today, simply did not exist yet in the Roman world. Diners ate mostly with their fingers, using a small spoon called a cochlea, with a thin pointed handle for eggs and shellfish, and a simple knife whenever meat needed cutting. That was more or less the entire toolkit, which meant hands got messy often, and that is exactly why a household slave circled the room again and again throughout the evening, pouring warm scented water over each guest's fingers and offering a towel to dry them before the next course arrived. It is worth pausing on that for a second. Every graceful detail we have just walked through, the reclining couches, the perfumed water, the perfectly timed courses, rested completely on the labour of people who were never invited to recline anywhere themselves. They stood at the edges of every one of these beautiful rooms, and history rarely bothered to write down their names. We know the names of the poets who wrote about these dinners in loving detail. We almost never know the names of the people who actually made the evening possible. Now about that spoon and knife making up the entire toolkit. Guests were also expected to bring one more item of their own to dinner, a napkin called a mappa tucked under an arm on the way out the door. This napkin did double duty. Guests used it to wipe their hands and mouths through the meal, and then once the final course had been cleared, it was considered completely acceptable, expected even to quietly fill that same napkin with whatever food remained and carry it home, an ancient version of the doggy bag centuries before the phrase existed. Naturally, some people took this a little too far. The poet Martial, always ready to poke fun at his fellow Romans, once wrote about a dinner guest so shameless that he stuffed his napkin full of shellfish, and half a roasted bird, carried the whole haul home up 200 steps, and then turned around and resold it the very next day. Some habits, it turns out, really are timeless. Dinner itself was rarely a quiet affair either. Wealthier hosts brought in musicians, poets, sometimes dancers to keep the evening moving between courses. Conversation mattered just as much as the food, and a host's reputation could rise or fall depending on how clever or how dull the evening's talk turned out to be. Depending on the company, that conversation might drift toward politics, fresh gossip from the forum, or genuine philosophy guests testing ideas back and forth, much the way we might argue about a film or a headline over dinner today. The topics change with the centuries. The instinct to talk something through over a shared meal apparently does not. Wine flowed freely too, but almost never on its own. Drinking wine undiluted was considered something only uncivilized outsiders did. A proper Roman dinner appointed someone for the evening, sometimes chosen by a roll of dice to act as a kind of referee for the wine itself, deciding exactly how much water should be mixed into every cup that night. It sounds almost silly today, handing a stranger control over your drink, but underneath the fun there was a real idea at work. Romans liked to believe that pleasure without any structure at all was something barbarians did. Structure even at a party was part of what made you Roman in the first place. Speaking of what people believe Romans did at dinner, there is one myth I have to clear up before we move any further because it comes up constantly. You've probably heard some version of it. A special room right off the dining hall where wealthy Romans would supposedly go to make themselves sick between courses just to keep eating. It even has a name people love to repeat, the vomitorium. Here is the honest answer. That room never existed. Not once, not anywhere in any surviving Roman building. The actual word vomitorium described something completely different, a wide passageway inside a theatre or an amphitheatre, built so that thousands of spectators could pour in and out quickly the way water spills from a wide opening. Writers eventually said the crowd itself seemed to be spewed out into the streets, and the name stuck to the doorway, not to any dinner guest. Now were a few famously excessive emperors accused by their own writers of making themselves sick just to keep eating. Occasionally, yes, and their own countrymen thought it was disgraceful, not impressive. But an entire architectural feature built for that exact purpose standing in every wealthy home across the empire. That part is pure legend repeated so often in movies and novels that most people now simply assume it has to be true. Even today, whenever someone wants a single face to represent Roman excess, a certain heavy, easygoing emperor we've already spent some time with tonight tends to come up first. So here is something worth carrying with you for a moment. Everything we just walked through together, the couches, the mosaic floors, the wine steward, the perfumed water, the folded napkin waiting by the door. None of it was simply what it meant to be Roman. It was what it meant to be a Roman with money connections and enough unpaid, unnamed labour working quietly in the background to make an evening look effortless. For the average person walking those same streets, dinner looked nothing like this at all. No couches, no mosaics of scattered olive pits, just a bowl eaten sitting on a plain stool or standing at a counter, or crouched on the floor of a cramped apartment with no kitchen of its own. So if the silver shield belonged to an emperor, and the reclining couch belonged to anyone lucky enough to afford one, who does that leave? What happened to everyone else across this enormous empire, the soldiers standing guard on some cold, distant border, the families crammed into apartments with no kitchen at all, the millions of ordinary Romans this entire language of food was never really built for? They ate too, of course, every single night, without couches, without mosaics, without a wine steward deciding how much water belonged in their cup. And the story of what actually sat in their bowl turns out to be far more interesting, and honestly far more human than anything we've looked at so far tonight. That is where we're headed next, toward the food nobody ever bragged about at a dinner party, and the surprisingly stubborn story hiding inside one simple bowl of porridge. A bowl of porridge. That is actually where this next part of the story begins, and I promise you by the end of it, that bowl is going to mean a great deal more to you than it does right now. The Romans called it pulse. Cracked wheat, usually a hardy grain, called emmer, boiled slowly in water until it thickened into something between a porridge and a paste, then seasoned with whatever happened to be on hand that day. A little salt, a splash of olive oil, if the household could spare it, sometimes nothing at all. no spices carried in from distant ports, no warship sent anywhere on its behalf. Just grain and water, and a low fire stirred by hand until it thickened enough to hold its shape in a bowl. It looked like almost nothing. Steam rising off a dull greyish paste in a cracked clay dish. It tasted like even less. And here is the part that tends to catch people off guard. According to the naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing hundreds of years after the fact, this bland little bowl was not some occasional peasant meal on the margins of Roman life. For the first 3 centuries of Rome's existence, before bread ovens spread across the city, before any of the spice trade or the silver platters or the flamingo tongues we have already spent time with tonight, pulse was essentially the only thing most Romans ate morning and evening both. Pliny even tells us they had a nickname for themselves because of it. Pultifagonists, porridge eaters, not an insult whispered by their enemies from across the sea, but a name the Romans wore themselves almost proudly for generations, the way a modern family might joke fondly about growing up on nothing but rice and beans. Sit with that for a second. Every road, every aqueduct, every law that would eventually shape half the known world was built by people whose daily meal was a bowl of boiled grain that most of us would not bother finishing today. Here is a small detail I cannot resist sharing because I love it far too much to leave out. That word pulse never really disappeared. It travelled forward through Latin into Old French and eventually into English, where it survives today as the word we use for beans, lentils, and split peas, pulse. So the next time you order lentil soup or add pulses to a grocery list without a second thought, you are echoing a word that fed Rome before Rome had much of anything else to offer the world. And grain was not only humble in Rome, it was sacred too. Before any official sacrifice, a small group of priestesses called the Vestal Virgins prepared a coarse salted grain mixture known as mola salsa, and sprinkled it directly over the head of whatever animal was about to be offered to the gods. That single ritual act of sprinkling grain gave the Latin language a new verb immolare, to immolate, a word that still survives in English today, quietly carrying the ghost of a pinch of salted wheat thrown by a priestess 2,000 years ago. The very same grain filling a soldier's bowl at dawn was at that same hour somewhere across the city being sprinkled over the neck of a sacrificial bull. Humble, sacred, and everywhere all at once. Funny how the plainest ingredient in any room is so often the one quietly doing the most important work, is it not? Now, even within something as humble as Pulse Rome still found a way to draw a line between rich and poor. The statesman Cato the Elder, writing a farming manual a couple of centuries before the empire reached its height, left behind detailed instructions on how to make it well, which tells you something on its own. This dish mattered enough to a serious practical man that he thought it deserved real instructions rather than a passing mention. A simple household cooked their grain in plain water with little more than a pinch of salt, and called that dinner night after night without complaint. A slightly better off family stirred in olive oil, maybe a spoonful of soft cheese to soften the flavour. Wealthier households further up the ladder folded in eggs honey, or the rich drippings left behind from roasted meat, until the very same base dish that fed a farmhand, also in a fancier form, occasionally reached a senator's table on a quiet evening at home, away from any grand banquet. Even inside the plainest food Rome had to offer, status found a way to sneak back in through the back door. Now let's leave the city behind for a moment and walk out to the edge of the empire, because Poles followed the army everywhere it marched. Roman soldiers lived in small groups of 8, sharing a tent, sharing chores, sharing meals, a unit the army called a contubernium, which translates roughly to those who share a tent. Each morning, long before a march that might cover 20 miles in full armour, these 8 men took turns grinding their own grain by hand with a small stone mill, the same dull, repetitive motion over and over in the grey light before sunrise. Once the grain was ground, it went into a shared pot, over a shared campfire, boiled into pulls or worked into a hard, dense bread called butzelatum. Tough enough to survive weeks inside a supply pack without spoiling the kind of bread you had to soften in water or wine before your teeth stood a real chance against it. Alongside it came salsamentum, a salty paste made from preserved fish, a bit of hard cheese, some olives, whatever dried fruit could be spared from home. It was not glamorous. Nobody wrote poetry about it, but it kept an entire army standing on its feet from one end of the known world to the other, one small shared meal at a time. Can you honestly imagine grinding your own breakfast by hand in the dark before walking 20 miles, carrying full armour on your back and doing it again the next morning, and the one after that? For years, alongside 7 other men who slowly stopped being strangers and started being something closer to family. To wash all of that down, soldiers and the urban poor alike reach for something called posca. At its simplest, posca was just sour wine or plain vinegar cut heavily with water, sometimes with a few herbs tossed in for flavour. It sounds unpleasant to modern ears, and honestly it probably tasted rough going down. But I want to push back gently on the idea that posca was only ever a symbol of poverty and misery, because there was real intelligence built into that drink. Water on the march was often unreliable, sometimes truly dangerous, and a splash of vinegar helped mask a foul taste, while making travellers a little more cautious about what exactly they were swallowing. Wine that had gone sour was not thrown away either. It was repurposed instead, which fit perfectly with a very Roman instinct for wasting almost nothing. Even the Emperor Hadrian, long before he wore a crown, is remembered fondly by his soldiers for choosing to survive for a while on nothing but bacon-fat hard cheese, and posca, the exact same rough rations his own men carried. Posca was not simply the drink of people who could not afford anything better. It was in its own quiet way a small piece of very practical engineering hiding inside a cup that nobody today would order twice. Here is something I find worth sitting with for a moment, and I want to be careful with it, because it touches on history a great many of you may already know well from an entirely different direction. Several historians who study this period have pointed out that when the Gospels describe a sponge of sour wine lifted up to a condemned man on the cross, that liquid was most likely posca, the exact same cheap watered-down drink carried by ordinary Roman soldiers on duty that day. Not necessarily a cruel invention meant to torment him further, as it is sometimes portrayed, but simply whatever a soldier standing guard already happened to have hanging from his belt. Historians disagree on the finer points, as historians tend to do, and no one can say it with total certainty this far removed from the event itself. But it remains a strange thought worth sitting with quietly. One of the most retold moments in the last 2,000 years may have involved the very same humble drink an 8-man tent group was sipping that same week, somewhere out on a dusty frontier road for entirely unremarkable reasons. Now, back inside the city itself, Rome had an entirely different problem to solve. By some point in its history, the city had swollen to nearly 1 million people, far more mouths than the surrounding farmland could ever hope to feed. So the state stepped in and built something the empire eventually leaned on for centuries, a grain dole known as the annona. Grain poured in from the wheat fields of Egypt and North Africa, shipped across the sea to warehouses along the Tiber River, then distributed first as raw grain, later as finished loaves to a list of registered households that eventually numbered somewhere around 200,000. Long lines formed at designated distribution points across the city, a particular hall in the Campus Martius, among the most famous of them, where an official called the prefect of the annona, personally answerable to the emperor himself, oversaw the entire operation. This was not charity offered quietly and without notice. It was political theatre on a massive scale. Coins were minted showing a goddess named Annona standing beside a ship loaded with grain, a constant visual reminder that the emperor stood personally between the people of Rome and hunger. Centuries later, when raw grain finally gave way to finished bread under one of the emperors who reformed the system, the change was not only kindness. A loaf could not be resold or hoarded the way a sack of wheat could, which meant less of it slipped away into the hands of people who did not need it. The poet Juvenal, watching all of this unfold with more than a little disdain, complained that the average Roman citizen had stopped caring about anything beyond two things: bread and entertainment. His complaint became so well known that we still reach for a version of it today whenever someone accuses a government of distracting its people rather than governing them properly. That word Annona, by the way, never fully vanished either. Wander through Italy or Spain today, and you will still find it tucked inside the language used to talk about food supply and provisioning a quiet little echo of every family that once stood in line along the Tiber, waiting for their share of the harvest. So think about what that actually means for a moment. An emperor could commission a silver platter wide enough to need 4 men just to carry it, and still understand somewhere underneath all that spectacle that his real grip on power rested on something far less glamorous. Whether or not 200,000 ordinary families received their grain on time that month. Egypt alone supplied so much of that grain that historians still describe it as the empire's breadbasket, and more than one emperor understood quietly and clearly that whoever controlled those harvests controlled Rome's mood as surely as any army ever could. A dinner party could make an emperor look ridiculous. A failed grain shipment could make him lose his throne, or worse. Here is where I want to gently push back on something, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should. When most people picture ancient Rome, the images that come to mind are almost always the extreme ones. Marble palaces, reclining banquets, silver shields piled with flamingo tongues. And to be fair, we have spent real time on exactly those images together tonight because they are true, and they are fascinating, and they deserve the attention we have given them. But they were never the whole story, or even most of it. Historians who study everyday Roman life keep circling back to the same quiet conclusion. For the overwhelming majority of the roughly 1,000 years Rome existed, the defining meal of an average Roman life was not roasted peacock, and it was not flamingo tongue either. It was this: grain water salt and whatever small comfort a family could afford to add on a good day, eaten by candlelight in a rented room with no kitchen of its own. Have you ever eaten plain oatmeal on a rough, exhausted morning and quietly called it comfort food anyway? If so, you already understand Pulse better than most historians, who have only studied it inside a book. You're standing closer to an ordinary Roman than any emperor with a silver platter ever stood. And honestly, there is something almost inspiring hiding inside all of this if you are willing to look for it. That contubernium of 8 soldiers grinding grain together before dawn, sharing one small fire and one shared pot, were bound to each other by something far sturdier than flavour. Pulse was never meant to impress anyone. It carried no status, no story, no name worth bragging about at a dinner party. It was meant to keep people alive together one ordinary morning after another for centuries on end, across deserts and forests and freezing riverbanks. Most of those soldiers had never expected to see when they first signed on. There is a kind of quiet dignity sitting inside a meal like that. The same dignity a lot of us reach for on our own, hardest, most unremarkable days, whether we ever stop to name it or not. Rome did not become an empire because a handful of emperors ate well. It became one because millions of ordinary people kept showing up to grind their grain, boil their pot and start the next day anyway. But here is where the story bends in an interesting direction. because for all the distance between a soldier's clay bowl and an emperor's silver platter, there was one single ingredient that somehow crossed that entire divide completely. Something so central to Roman taste that it showed up in the poorest camp meal and the most extravagant imperial feast alike without a single exception, without regard for rank or wealth or status of any kind. It sat beside pulse in a soldier's tent. It sat beside flamingo tongue on a silver shield. Something most people today would find quite honestly disgusting the moment they learned exactly how it was made. That is where we are headed next. Somewhere outside the walls of nearly every major Roman city set well upwind from anyone who mattered, sat a row of shallow stone vats that smelled worse than almost anything else in the ancient world. Inside them, under an open sky, fish guts and fish blood, and whole small fish sat packed in thick layers of salt slowly breaking down in the heat. For weeks, sometimes for months, until the entire mixture turned into a thin amber-coloured liquid. Flies gathered. Neighbours complained on the rare occasion they lived near enough to complain. And yet that liquid had a name people spoke with something bordering on reverence. Garum. And here is the part that still catches people off guard every single time I tell this story. It was not some rare punishment food forced only on the desperate and the poor. It sat on nearly every table in the Roman world, rich or poor, humble or imperial without exception. If pulse fed Rome's body, garum told Rome exactly what it wanted its food to taste like. Let's slow down for a second, because the actual process is worth understanding properly, not just wrinkling your nose at. Fishermen brought in whatever was running that season, often small oily fish like anchovies, sardines or mackerel, sometimes larger fish too heavy or too bony to sell whole. Workers packed the fish guts and all into wide vats along with heavy amounts of salt, then simply left the mixture out under the sun. No cooking, no fire, just salt heat and time breaking the fish down through fermentation, until enzymes already present in their own bodies did the rest of the work. After weeks of this, sometimes closer to 3 months, depending on the season, and the fish workers strained the liquid away from the solid remains. What came out the other end, a rich, salty, almost meaty tasting liquid, was garum. Whatever thick paste stayed behind in the strainer had a name too, alec a cheaper, rougher byproduct that even the poorest households could usually still afford. Now you might wonder why anyone allowed this to happen anywhere near a city at all. The honest answer is they mostly did not, and for good reason. These fermentation yards, called soteria, were almost always built outside the city walls, downwind, tucked away from anyone with the money to complain about the smell reaching their dinner table. Rome loved what came out of those vats. Rome simply did not want to watch or smell how any of it got there. Does that sound familiar at all? A society perfectly happy to enjoy something delicious, as long as the unpleasant part of making it stayed safely out of view, tucked behind a wall somewhere nobody important had to look at it. We have not exactly outgrown that particular instinct in 2,000 years. The Romans did not invent this idea from nothing either. Fermented fish sauces like this stretch back earlier to Greek and Phoenician traders, working the Mediterranean coastline centuries before Rome ever built an empire worth mentioning. The word garum itself likely grew out of an older Greek word for a small fish once used to make something similar. Rome simply took an old practical idea and turned it into something closer to a national obsession, and Rome moved a staggering amount of it. Marine archaeologists exploring shipwrecks scattered across the floor of the Mediterranean keep pulling up the same telltale clue, row after row, of narrow-pointed clay amphorum, many of them still faintly smelling of fish after 2,000 years underwater sunk on their way from one coastal city to another. Garum was not a local specialty enjoyed only near the vats that made it. It travelled by the shipload, threading its way from Spain to Gaul to Italy, to the far edges of the empire, riding the same trade routes that carried wine, olive oil and grain. A jar of Spanish garum might end up seasoning a soldier's dinner in Britain, or a senator's private feast in Rome itself, having crossed more open water than most of those men ever would in their entire lives. And because it was everywhere, garum came in every level of quality you can imagine, exactly the way wine or cheese does today. Cheaper versions were thin and rough, made from whatever scraps a coastal town had on hand that week. But at the very top of the market sat something called garum sociorum, produced along the coast of what is now Spain in a city called Cartagena. Have you ever splurged on a fancy finishing oil or an aged vinegar just to drizzle over one special meal? You already understand exactly the impulse a wealthy Roman felt reaching for a small jar of this. This premium version leaned on the blood and organs of mackerel, specifically aged with extra care, and it fetched a price that could rival perfume ounce for ounce. A wealthy Roman host proudly serving garum sociorum at dinner was not so different from a modern host, pouring a truly expensive, carefully aged wine for guests they wanted to impress. There is a real person worth introducing here because his story says more about garum's true place in Roman life than any recipe ever could. A Pompeian businessman named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus built an entire fortune out of fish sauce alone. His name stamped or painted onto jar after jar has turned up on nearly a third of every fish sauce container ever recovered from Pompeii and the surrounding region, which tells you plainly who dominated that particular market. Scaurus felt proud enough of his product that he had the floor of his own front hall decorated with a mosaic showing 4 labelled jars of his finest garum and liquamen, complete with painted slogans boasting about their quality, an advertisement built directly into his own doorstep for every guest to step over on their way inside for dinner. It worked. His fish sauce fortune grew large enough to launch his family into real political standing, and his son went on to rise into one of the highest civic offices Pompeii had to offer. Somewhere underneath all that marble and civic honour sat vat after vat of rotting fish. Rome, it turns out, has always known exactly how to dress up a smell in fine clothing. Naturally, Roman writers could not agree on whether any of this was actually a good idea, and I find their argument almost more entertaining than the sauce itself. Pliny the Elder, forever curious about the natural world, called garum an exquisite liquid, and claimed the finest versions were pleasant enough to be sipped on their own like a fine cordial. Meanwhile, the philosopher Seneca, never shy about criticizing Roman excess, described garum as the costly extract of poisonous fish and insisted it quietly burned up the stomach with what he called its salted putrefaction. So which one of them was right? Honestly, probably both, depending entirely on which vat, which season, and which coastal town your particular bottle came from. Rome was a big place. Not every fish sauce was created equal. Pliny did not stop at simply admiring the flavour either. He recommended garum as a treatment for dysentery, claimed it eased the pain of a dog bite, and suggested that snails soaked in the stuff would settle an upset stomach. Whether any of that actually worked is, generously speaking, questionable, but it tells you something about how deeply this sauce had worked its way into Roman daily life, when a liquid most of us would refuse to put anywhere near an open wound was instead being recommended as the cure for one. Once garum existed, Roman cooks refused to leave it alone. They mixed it with black pepper to make garum piperatum. They stirred it into wine for unagarum, or into vinegar for oxygarum, or into plain olive oil for oleogarum, each version suited to a different dish, a different season, a different mood at the table. Out on the frontier, soldiers received a heavily watered-down version, called hydrogarum, cheap enough to produce in bulk and stretch across an entire legion, made in enormous quantities at factories as far away as Armorica in what we now call Brittany on the coast of France. If that sounds familiar, it should. The very same soldiers stretching their wine into Posca out of pure practicality were doing the exact same thing with their fish sauce, thinning out a strong, costly flavour until an entire army marching along a cold frontier could still afford a small taste of home. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why would an entire civilization build so much of its culinary identity around something that smelled by most modern accounts absolutely horrendous? The answer, it turns out, has less to do with Roman taste being strange and more to do with basic food chemistry that we now understand far better than they ever could have. Fermenting fish this way breaks proteins down into free amino acids, including one in particular called glutamate, the exact same compound responsible for that deep, savory, mouth-filling sensation we now call umami. It is the same flavour science hiding inside a good aged cheese, a long-simmered beef broth, or a spoonful of soy sauce stirred into a bowl of noodles. The Romans could not have named the chemistry behind it, of course. They had no notion of amino acids or flavour receptors on the tongue. They simply knew through centuries of trial and habit that a few drops of this pungent liquid made almost anything taste more like itself, richer, deeper, more satisfying than salt alone ever could. They were not wrong about any of it. They were simply about 2,000 years ahead of the scientists who would eventually explain why. Archaeology has actually confirmed how central garum truly was in a way I find quietly remarkable. Researchers studying preserved garum residue recovered from sealed containers in Pompeii were able to identify the exact species of fish used in one particular batch, a small schooling fish that only gathers along that coastline during the warmest summer months. That single detail helped confirm the season, and even the likely month of the eruption that buried the city, adding real weight to long-standing arguments about exactly when Mount Vesuvius destroyed the town. Somewhere in a broken clay jar of fermented fish sauce sat a clue that helped modern historians pin down one of the most famous disasters in the ancient world. Not bad for something most people assume was simply rotten garbage. So here is a thought I want to leave sitting with you for a moment. Does any of this still sound completely foreign to you? Because it should not really. Walk into almost any Vietnamese, Thai or Korean kitchen today, and you will find bottles of fish sauce made through a process that would look immediately familiar to a Roman fish sauce maker. 2,000 years ago, small fish salt patience and time, nothing more complicated than that. Along Italy's Amalfi coast, a sauce called colatura di alici is still made from anchovies today, using techniques passed down through families for generations, arguably the closest living relative garum has left anywhere in the world. In the south of France, a paste called pisala carries much of the same character spread thinly across bread, the way an ancient Roman might have drizzled garum straight onto a piece of theirs. A few years back, researchers in Spain even attempted a full scientific reconstruction of ancient garum, using residue analysis and old recipes to recreate something remarkably near the original, now sold in small amphory-shaped bottles, as an unusual but perfectly real culinary curiosity for anyone brave enough to try it. The thing you were probably picturing as pure ancient grossness a few minutes ago is in some form sitting quietly in a kitchen cabinet somewhere on this planet tonight, and possibly closer to your own kitchen than you might think. What is fascinating to me, and honestly a little sad in its own quiet way, is how completely the West managed to forget all of this. Centuries after Rome fell, a Western European envoy named Liutprand of Cremona travelled to visit the court of Constantinople, the surviving eastern half of the old Roman world, where fermented fish sauce was still a normal, unremarkable part of the table. He came home horrified, complaining bitterly that the food had been drowned in what he called an extremely disgusting fish liquid, as though his hosts had committed some small crime against decent taste. The very same flavour that Roman senators had once paid perfume prices for had become to his medieval European eyes something almost unspeakable, a mark of foreignness rather than a mark of luxury. Taste, it turns out, is not really permanent at all. It is inherited, taught, and just as easily lost sometimes across nothing more than a few centuries and a changing set of borders. A flavour can be the height of sophistication in one generation and a source of open disgust in the very next without a single molecule of the recipe itself ever actually changing. Which maybe tells us something a little bigger than fish sauce if you're willing to sit with it for a second. The things we call disgusting are rarely about the food itself. They're almost always about distance, about how far removed we've become from the hands that made it, and the mouths that once truly loved it. Somewhere in Rome, on the very same night that a shield of silver and flamingo tongue sat gleaming under torchlight for an emperor, a small clay jug of this exact same pungent, salty liquid was quietly sitting on a soldier's shared table, too thinned with water, doing precisely the same job for two very different men, living two entirely different lives. Rich or poor, celebrated or forgotten, everyone at that table in one form or another was reaching for the same jar, but not every ingredient hiding in a Roman kitchen was this honest about what it actually was. Garum smelled dangerous from the moment you walked near it, and turned out to be for the most part simply strong, strange, and surprisingly good for you. There was something else sitting on that same table, though. Something sweet. Something Romans trusted completely poured generously into wine and sauces and desserts alike, without a second thought, that was quietly doing far more lasting damage than a vat of fermented fish ever could have dreamed of. That is where we are headed next. Sweetness, it turns out, told a much quieter lie than fish sauce ever did. Garum announced itself from 100 paces away, pungent and unmistakable, impossible to hide from anyone with a working nose. What we're about to talk about did the exact opposite. It slipped onto the Roman table wearing the most trustworthy disguise a food could ever wear. A rich, comforting sweetness poured warmly into wine on a cold evening, stirred gently into fruit and sauces, without a single hint of anything wrong. No smell to warn you, no sharp taste to make you pause before the second sip. Just sweetness again and again, quietly doing its work. The Romans called it sapa, or sometimes defrutum, depending on how far they reduced it, and it started life as something completely ordinary, plain grape juice fresh from the press before fermentation ever turned it into wine. Cooks would pour that raw juice into a wide metal pot and simply let it simmer for hours, slowly boiling away the water until what remained was thick, dark, and intensely sweet, closer to syrup than juice. Boil it down to about 2/3 of its original volume, and Romans called it caruinum. Reduce it further to roughly half and you had defrutum. Push it all the way down to 1/3 of where it started, and you had sapa, the strongest, sweetest version of them all, in a world with no refined sugar, no honey supply large enough to sweeten everything a kitchen might need. This thick grape syrup became one of the most trusted ingredients in the entire Roman pantry, stirred into sauces poured over fruit to help it keep through the winter, and added to wine that had turned too sharp and bitter to enjoy on its own. Here is where the story quietly turns, because the pot that syrup simmered inside mattered a great deal more than anyone realized at the time. It helps to understand why Rome leaned on this syrup so heavily in the first place. Honey existed, of course, and Romans loved it, but real honey stayed truly expensive and unpredictable in supply, dependent on bees' weather and a beekeeper's good fortune in any given year. Refined sugar as we know it today did not exist anywhere in the Roman world at all, not for another 1,000 years or more. So a cheap, reliable way to sweeten wine, preserve fruit through a long winter, or round out a sharp sauce was not some small indulgence reserved for the fussy or the wealthy. It solved a real practical kitchen problem one nearly every household faced sooner or later, which helps explain why so few people ever thought twice about which pot they were using to make it. The Roman writer Columella, who left behind one of the most detailed farming manuals to survive from antiquity, gave very specific instructions on this exact point. He recommended cooking the grape juice down in vessels made of lead rather than bronze, explaining plainly that bronze pots left behind a sharp, unpleasant taste, as the mixture boiled something bordering on rust, while lead simply produced a better result. Pliny the Elder agreed, recommending the same thing in his own writing. This was not an accident or an oversight born of ignorance about metals in general. Roman cooks tested their options, compared the results side by side, and chose lead on purpose because it made the syrup taste noticeably better. They had, without knowing it, discovered one of history's earliest and most dangerous food additives purely by chasing good flavour. Let's talk about why lead actually did that, because the chemistry is honestly fascinating once you understand it. Grape juice contains a fair amount of acetic acid, the same acid found in ordinary vinegar. When that acid reacts with lead over hours of slow boiling, it produces a compound called lead acetate, which chemists later nicknamed quite literally sugar of lead. And here is the unsettling part. Lead acetate truly does taste sweet. Sweet enough that people used crystallized versions of it as an actual sweetener for centuries afterward, long after Rome itself was gone. Modern researchers who attempted to recreate ancient sapper, using authentic lead vessels and the original method, measured lead levels in the finished syrup that were almost 1,000 times higher than what any modern safety agency on Earth would allow in food today. A single generous spoonful stirred into an evening's wine was already doing quiet cumulative damage no Roman dinner guest could taste, smell, or see coming. And the story does not stop at a boiling pot either, which is honestly the part that unsettles me most. Over time, some Romans learned they could manufacture a version of this compound directly without waiting on a slow simmering syrup at all, by exposing a lead compound called litharge to plain vinegar until it formed clear, solid crystals remarkably similar in appearance to table salt or refined sugar. What began as an accidental byproduct of good cooking technique eventually became something people knew how to produce on purpose. That should tell you something important about how convincing the sweetness really was. Nobody sets out to manufacture their own poison deliberately again and again unless the reward truly felt worth chasing. Can you imagine drinking something for years, honestly enjoying it, certain it was making your evening better, while it slowly worked against you the entire time? That in a very real sense is exactly what an untold number of Romans were doing, one sweetened cup at a time. This was not some rare occasional ingredient either tucked away in only a handful of unusual recipes reserved for special occasions. Historians studying the great Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius have counted somewhere near one recipe in every 5 calling for sapa or de frutum, somewhere in the method sweetening sauces for meat, fruit and wine alike, folded so casually into everyday cooking instructions that a Roman reader would barely have registered it as anything worth a second thought. We will spend real time with that particular cookbook and the strange, complicated man behind it before this night is over, because his story turns out to be just as revealing as any single ingredient sitting on his shelf. For now, it is enough to know that whatever fame Roman cuisine eventually earned for its rich, complex flavour, a meaningful share of that richness was quietly built on a compound we would now recognize immediately as a poison The symptoms crept in slowly, which made them almost impossible to trace back to a favourite sweetened wine sipped calmly at dinner for years without a single obvious sign of trouble. Lead poisoning dulls the sense of taste over time, which cruelly tends to make a person crave stronger, sweeter flavours rather than weaker ones, encouraging exactly the behaviour that caused the problem in the first place, a small, vicious cycle hidden inside every refill. Continued exposure has been linked to joint pain resembling gout, a condition that shows up again and again in descriptions of wealthy Roman men, in particular, the very same men most likely to be drinking sweetened imported wine on a nightly basis. It has been linked to fertility problems, to miscarriage, to slow, creeping changes in mood and mental clarity that a worried Roman family might simply have chalked up to bad temperament or old age or the will of the gods, having no other framework available to explain what was actually happening quietly inside a person's body one dinner at a time. Now, supper was only ever part of the story because Rome had built an entire second pathway straight to the same metal running underneath the city itself. Roman engineers were rightly celebrated for their aqueducts and their plumbing, moving fresh water across entire landscapes and directly into private homes. A real marvel for its time, the kind of infrastructure most of the ancient world could only dream about. Water travelled for many miles along carefully sloped stone channels, crossed valleys on towering arch bridges still standing today, and eventually poured straight into the courtyards and fountains of homes that could afford the connection. Much of that final stretch of plumbing ran through pipes made of, you guessed it, lead, because the metal was soft, easy to shape around a curve, and simple to seal along a seam without any special tools. In fact, the English word plumbing traces its roots straight back to the Latin word for lead itself, plumbum, the same root behind the chemical symbol Pb that still labels the element on a periodic table today. Every time a plumber shows up at your door in the modern world, the job title itself is quietly repeating a 2,000-year-old Roman word for a mistake we're still in a strange linguistic sense cleaning up after. To be fair to the Romans, at least one of them saw part of this coming, and I think he deserves to be remembered for it. The architect Vitruvius, writing a detailed manual on construction and engineering that architects still study today, warned his readers directly that water carried through lead pipes seemed less healthy than water drawn from clay ones. He did not stop at a vague warning either. He pointed specifically to the workers who handled lead for a living day after day, describing their skin as noticeably pale and unhealthy looking, compared to other labourers doing equally hard work, and recommended clay piping instead wherever it was practical, even though clay pipes were more fragile and harder to install around tight corners. It is a striking passage to encounter today proof that at least one careful observant Roman came remarkably near, identifying a real public health danger centuries before modern chemistry could explain exactly why he was right. But convenience, cost and simple habit won out the way they so often do in every century, including our own, and lead pipes kept right on carrying water into Roman homes for generations, after his warning was written down and quietly filed away in a library somewhere ignored by the very people who most needed to hear it. Here is a detail I find worth sitting with for a moment because it flips something we have talked about earlier tonight almost completely on its head. With fish sauce, the poorest Romans and the wealthiest Romans both reach for the exact same jar, rich or poor, without much distinction at all. Lead worked in the opposite direction entirely. It was the wealthy who owned private homes fitted with lead piping, instead of relying on a public fountain down the street. It was the wealthy who could afford fine imported wine carefully sweetened with sapa, rather than the rough, watered-down posca that soldiers and the urban poor were already drinking out of simple necessity. Does that surprise you at all? It surprised me the first time I really sat with it. We tend to assume that wealth brought safety in the ancient world, better food, better shelter, better everything. And most of the time, honestly, it did. But in this one particular corner of Roman life, refinement itself may have been the more dangerous choice at the table. The instinct to reach for something a little smoother, a little sweeter, a little more expensive was without anyone involved realizing it. Often the riskier decision, not the safer one. Somewhere out on a cold frontier, a soldier drinking rough, watered-down Posca out of a shared cup may have unknowingly been protecting himself far better than the senator sipping fine sweetened wine back in his own private dining room. Now, I want to be careful here because this is a place where popular history tends to get a little carried away, and I would rather hand you the more honest version than the more dramatic one. You may have heard the claim sometimes repeated with a great deal of confidence that lead poisoning single-handedly brought down the entire Roman Empire, driving its emperors mad and quietly hollowing out its ruling class from within one poisoned cup at a time. It makes for a dramatic headline, and it is not entirely without evidence behind it. But most historians studying this today are considerably more careful with that claim than the headlines tend to be. Lead exposure was widespread across nearly the whole ancient Mediterranean world in Greek cities and Phoenician ports long before Rome existed, not just within Roman borders specifically, which makes it a poor single explanation for the fall of one particular empire and not the others surrounding it. Rome's eventual decline involved economic strain, military overreach, political instability, and outside pressure from many directions at once, a tangle far too complicated to pin on any single cause, no matter how compelling that cause might sound in a single sentence. What we can say with real confidence is narrower and honestly still remarkable enough on its own. An empire capable of extraordinary engineering of aqueducts and indoor plumbing, and carefully reduced grape syrup was also through those very same achievements, slowly poisoning a meaningful share of its own wealthier citizens, one sweetened cup and one private pipe at a time for centuries, without a single one of them ever fully understanding why. There is something almost poetic sitting inside that thought, if you let it settle for a moment. Garum announced exactly what it was the moment you walked anywhere near it. Honest, pungent, impossible to ignore. Sapa did the opposite entirely. It hid behind sweetness, behind refinement, behind the comfortable feeling of doing something exactly right, night after night, cup after cup. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the table is not the one that smells the worst. It is the one that tastes like everything is going perfectly fine. But sweetness and stench were only ever two threads inside a much larger obsession. Two ingredients pulling Roman cuisine in opposite directions at once. Honesty on one side and disguise on the other. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, one particular Roman decided that food itself deserved to be treated as an art form, worth an entire fortune, worth building a lifelong reputation on, worth eventually staking his very life against. That is where we are headed next. That particular Roman had a name, and once you hear the full story behind it, you will understand exactly why it still echoes through kitchens today 2,000 years later, whether the people cooking in them realize it or not. Marcus Gavius Apicius lived during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, in the first stretch of what we now call the Roman Empire, and he built his entire identity, his entire reputation, his entire sense of self-worth around a single pursuit: eating extraordinarily well. Not simply enjoying food the way most of us do, comfortably, gratefully, without much thought, beyond the next satisfying bite. Apicius treated the pursuit of flavor the way a general treated a military campaign, with strategy, with obsession, with a willingness to spend almost anything to win. He kept company with the very top of Roman society too, dining at times with Maecenas himself, the trusted cultural advisor, standing at Augustus's right hand, which tells you plainly that this was not some eccentric outsider muttering about sources from the margins of polite company. Apicius sat comfortably at the centre of it. A Greek writer named Athenaeus, summing up his reputation a couple of centuries later, put it about as bluntly as language allows. Apicius, he wrote, spent countless sums on his belly. Not an insult exactly. More of a plain unavoidable fact repeated so often by so many different writers that it eventually became the entire shape of the man's legacy. Let me give you one story that tells you everything you need to know about him before we get to anything else. Word reached Apicius that extraordinary oversized prawns could be found off the coast of Libya, larger and finer than anything available closer to home. So he did what any reasonable person with unlimited money and very little patience might do. He chartered a ship, loaded it with supplies, and set sail across open water toward North Africa, chasing nothing more than a rumour about shellfish. Picture the scale of that decision for a moment. No refrigeration, no easy way home if the weather turned an entire private voyage funded out of pure curiosity about the size of somebody's dinner. When the ship finally neared the coast, local fishermen rowed out to meet him, carrying baskets of their very best prawns, eager to sell to the wealthy Roman. Everyone had clearly been talking about for days before he even arrived. Apicius took one look at the catch, decided it was not actually superior to what he could already get back home, and gave the order to turn the ship around immediately without ever once setting foot on Libyan soil. An entire sea crossing undertaken and abandoned over shellfish that failed to impress him at a glance. Does that sound like dedication to you, or does it sound like something closer to an illness? Honestly, I think it depends entirely on the day you ask me. His reputation travelled all the way to the very top of Roman society too, which tells you something about how thoroughly his name had become shorthand for extravagant taste, recognisable enough to build a joke around, without any further explanation needed. The historian Pliny the Elder records a small sharp joke made by the Emperor Tiberius himself. A mullet of enormous size had been presented to the emperor as a gift, the kind of prize fish wealthy Romans loved to show off proudly at dinner, practically a trophy you could eat. Rather than serve it at his own table, Tiberius ordered the fish sent instead to the public market to be sold, remarking with dry amusement that he would be very surprised if a man named Apicius did not end up buying it before the day was through. The joke only works, of course, if everyone listening already understood exactly who Apicius was and exactly what kind of money he was known to throw at a single spectacular fish without blinking. An emperor, ruling the largest empire the world had yet seen, still found it worth his time to make a private citizen, the punchline of a dinner-table joke about excess. That tells you plainly just how far this one man's reputation had travelled. Here is a smaller story I happen to love because it reveals something a little different about the man, something closer to vanity than appetite. Drusus, the son of the Emperor Tiberius, apparently developed a fondness for cabbage sprouts, a perfectly ordinary, humble little vegetable enjoyed by households across the entire empire, rich and poor alike. Apicius, we are told, personally talked him out of it, convincing the young man that cabbage sprouts were far too common a food for someone of his standing to be seen eating. Think about that for a moment. A private citizen with no political office and no military command to his name held enough social influence over the emperor's own son to steer him away from a vegetable purely on the grounds that it was beneath him. That is not really about flavour at all, is it? That is about status wearing the disguise of taste, using a dinner plate to draw an invisible line between who belonged at the top of Roman society and who did not. Have you ever caught yourself avoiding a perfectly good, perfectly ordinary meal simply because it felt somehow beneath the image you wanted to present that evening? Apicius built an entire career on turning that small familiar impulse into an art form. But underneath all of that confidence, all of that influence, a much less glamorous problem had been quietly building for years, the way these things so often do when nobody involved wants to look directly at it. The philosopher Seneca, writing not long after these events, tells us that Apicius spent something in the neighbourhood of 100 million sesterces on his kitchen alone across his lifetime, an almost unthinkable sum by any standard of the ancient world, more wealth than most Roman provinces generated in tax revenue across an entire year. At every single banquet he hosted, he poured out spending equal to the many generous gifts he had received over the years from the emperors themselves. For a long time, none of that seemed to matter. The money simply kept flowing, the banquets kept happening, and nobody, least of all Apicius, felt any particular need to check the balance underneath all that spectacle. Why would he? The whole point of that kind of wealth in his mind was never having to look too closely at where it was going. Then, according to Seneca, the day finally came when he was forced, for what may have been the very first time in his adult life, to actually sit down and examine his own accounts, honestly, the way any ordinary household might do at the end of a difficult month. What he found should have been enormously reassuring. Even after decades of legendary excess, Apicius still had roughly 10 million sesterces remaining, a fortune so large that most Romans alive at the time could not have imagined possessing even a small fraction of it in 10 lifetimes. By any sane measurement, he was still an extraordinarily wealthy man. But Apicius did not measure his life by any sane standard. He measured it entirely against the version of himself that had once commanded 100 million, the version who never once had to think twice before buying an entire shipload of shellfish on a whim. Faced with the idea of living out his remaining years on what he now considered a diminished fortune forced in his own mind into something resembling scarcity, Apicius chose to end his own life rather than adjust to it. I want to sit with that for just a moment gently, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention before we move on. Seneca himself was fairly unforgiving about it, using Apicius almost as a cautionary parable for his readers, a warning about what happens when a person's entire sense of worth becomes tangled up completely in what they consume, rather than in who they actually are underneath all of it. Seneca's judgment was sharp, and honestly, reading it today, still fair. There is something quietly tragic sitting inside this story, a reminder that 10 million of anything can still feel like nothing at all if the only yardstick you have ever allowed yourself is the very top of your own past excess. If any of you are ever sitting with a truly difficult moment around money identity, or the fear of losing what you have built, please know that support exists, and reaching for it is a sign of strength, not weakness. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, though, because the most lasting thing Apicius ever created did not actually come from his own hand at all, not in the way most people assume. Centuries after his death, a Roman cookbook began circulating under the title De Re Coquinaria, meaning simply, on the subject of cooking, and it carried his name attached to it, Apicius, as though he himself had personally written down every recipe inside. Scholars studying the surviving manuscripts today are fairly confident this is not literally true, and to complicate matters further, Apicius was not even an especially rare name to begin with. At least one other notable gourmet bearing the same family name lived a century or so earlier, which means whenever an ancient writer mentions someone called Apicius, historians still have to work out carefully which one they actually mean. The book we actually have appears to have been assembled centuries later, likely compiled from older Greek and Roman sources, borrowed recipes and household notes gathered together under one convenient famous name. Interestingly, a good number of its recipes still call for a rare, treasured seasoning called silphium, an ingredient that had already vanished from the natural world by the time later editors were still copying this book, down a small clue suggesting some of these recipes really do reach back to Apicius's own lifetime, tangled in among centuries of later editions. In other words, by the time this cookbook took its final shape, Apicius had already become something bigger than a single wealthy man with an expensive appetite. He had become a brand, a stamp of culinary authority borrowed by later writers the same way a modern cookbook might invoke a legendary chef's name to sell copies whether or not that chef ever personally tested a single recipe inside its pages. And what a strange, difficult little book it turned out to be once you actually sit down and try reading through it. There are no measured quantities anywhere inside, no careful cup or spoon amounts, the way a modern recipe card would list them. Instructions come across more like shorthand notes between working professionals than guidance for a curious beginner, assuming the reader already understood how to cook and simply needed reminding what to combine and roughly how. It is organized into 10 separate books by category poultry, in one section, seafood in another, sauces and preserved meats filling out the rest. A structure that still faintly resembles how many cookbooks organize themselves today. Buried somewhere inside those pages sit some of the strangest, most memorable dishes anyone ever attached to Roman dining dishes we're going to open up together very soon. The oldest surviving copies of this manuscript only date back to around the 8th and 9th centuries, hundreds of years after Apicius himself had died, copied and recopied by hand through generations of scribes who never once met the man whose name sat on the cover. Some of the language inside even shifts noticeably partway through, moving between more formal classical Latin and looser everyday phrasing, a small but telling clue that different recipes were folded in at very different points across the centuries long after the original Apicius could possibly have contributed anything himself. And here is a detail I find quietly charming. A handful of specific dishes inside the collection carry his name directly attached to them, labelled things like Apician stew or Apician-style cutlets, almost the ancient equivalent of a signature dish named in a chef's honour at a restaurant that chef never actually worked in. Long after his death, other cooks kept borrowing his name to lend their own creations a little extra shine, which is in its own strange way a kind of immortality most of us will never manage to earn. Here is the question I keep circling back to the longer I sit with this man's story. How much of your own identity right now tonight is quietly tied up in something you consume, something you buy, something you show other people, rather than something you simply are underneath all of it? Apicius built an entire life around being the person who ate better than anyone else alive, and when that particular throne felt even slightly unsteady beneath him, he could not imagine continuing to exist without it. That is not really a story about shellfish or cabbage sprouts, or even about money in the end. It is a story about what happens when the things we consume quietly become the only measure we trust for who we are. There is something familiar sitting inside all of this too, if you look at it from the right angle. We still do this, do we not, just wearing different clothing? A cookbook still sells better with a famous chef's face printed across the cover, whether or not that chef personally tested every recipe pressed between its pages. A restaurant still trades on a founder's name and reputation decades after that founder has stopped setting foot in the kitchen. Apicius understood something about fame and flavour that modern marketing departments are still quite profitably rediscovering all over again, generation after generation, as if nobody had ever thought of it before. So let's open that strange borrowed cookbook properly now and meet one of its more unforgettable residents, something small, something furry, something the Romans went to remarkable lengths to fatten up before it ever reached the table. That is where we are headed next. Picture a plain clay jar sitting quietly in the corner of a Roman garden, unremarkable from the outside, half buried in soil, the kind of thing you might walk straight past without a second glance. Inside, though something small and furry was spending its entire short life being fattened for dinner one walnut at a time in near total darkness, growing rounder and slower with every passing week. The Romans called it a glirarium, built specifically to raise glyers, the edible dormouse, a plump little rodent closer in size and character to a squirrel than to the mice most of us picture scurrying along a modern kitchen floor. The writer Varro, in his detailed manual on farming, described exactly how this worked. Wealthier households with real land kept dormice in large outdoor pens, their walls carefully polished or plastered smooth, so the animals could never quite find enough grip to climb out. Inside these pens grew the very trees whose nuts the dormice loved best, chestnut, acorn and beech, so the animals spent their days feeding themselves without anyone needing to lift a finger. But in a crowded city house with no room for an entire orchard, a different solution took over. Potters shaped a hollow clay jar ribbed along the inside like a tiny spiral staircase, ventilated with small breathing holes, fitted with a little trough for food and water that could be refilled from outside without ever disturbing the resident within. There was no need to ever open the jar itself, no need to check in, no need to interact with the animal at all beyond keeping its trough full. The dormouse climbed those internal ridges the way we might pace a room while thinking restless movement inside a space built to feel, as one classicist has rather charmingly put it, remarkably similar to a very small, very determined hamster wheel. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people the most, and I love watching it land. This entire practice was at one point officially illegal. Back in the year we would now call 115 before the Common Era, a Roman consul named Marcus Aemilius Scaurus pushed through a law specifically banning dormice from being served at banquets, lumped in together with exotic imported birds and certain shellfish, considered equally wasteful part of a broader wave of what historians now call sumptuary legislation laws, written explicitly to rein in conspicuous private spending. Rome passed quite a few of these over the centuries, restricting everything from how much silverware a household could display to how many guests a single dinner party was technically allowed to invite. The law was not really about animal welfare or health, or anything we might recognize as a modern concern. It was aimed squarely at excess itself, an attempt by Rome's more traditional voices to slow down a wealthy class that seemed determined to outspend and outimpress one another at every single dinner party. And how well did that law actually work? About as well as most laws written to stop rich people from showing off tend to work anywhere in any century. Wealthy households kept right on serving dormice for generations afterward. The ban quietly ignored more of a talking point for moralists than an actual obstacle standing between anyone and their appetizer course. There is one man in particular worth naming here because his fingerprints sit all over this entire chapter of Roman food history in more than one direction at once. A gentleman farmer named Fulvius Lipinus, sometimes recorded under the name Hirpinus, is generally credited as the person who first turned dormouse fattening into a proper organized business sometime around the middle of the 1st century, before the Common Era, right around the turbulent years leading into the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And remarkably, the exact same man is also credited as the pioneer of something else entirely, something we will come back to in just a moment. Lipinus clearly had a gift and an appetite for turning small ordinary creatures into a luxury product worth real money at a moment in Roman history when fortunes were being made and lost faster than almost any generation before it. Once fattened, a dormouse did not simply get thrown into a pot and forgotten. The cookbook attributed to Apicius records a proper method for the dish stuffing the little animal with a forcemeat made from minced pork, mixed with trimmings from its own limbs, seasoned generously with pepper pine nuts, and a treasured pungent seasoning called laser, distantly related to that vanished plant we spent time with not long ago tonight, before finally being roasted in the oven or gently simmered in a stock pot until tender. Notice how much care went into a dish most of us would never willingly put in our mouths today. This was not thrown together carelessly. It was seasoned, layered, and finished with the exact same attention a proud cook might bring to a roast pheasant or a fine cut of beef. It was considered refined enough to appear as a starter, the small opening course meant to wake up an appetite before the real meal even began. Sitting alongside olives and eggs on the same tray, a guest might reach across without much thought. In one especially famous fictional banquet from Roman literature, a satirical scene mocking a fabulously wealthy former slave desperate to impress his dinner guests. Dormice show up rolled in honey and sprinkled with poppy seed, balanced delicately on tiny decorative bridges soldered directly onto the serving plate, presented with exactly the kind of theatrical flair we will spend real time unpacking properly before this story's over. Even fiction, it turns out, could not resist reaching for the dormouse whenever a scene called for a symbol of money spent purely to be noticed. Now back to Lipanus for a moment, because dormice were only half of what made him famous. That same enterprising Roman also built what may be history's first serious commercial snail farm, an operation he called a cochlearium, essentially a snailery protected by a water channel, too wide for any ambitious snail to cross unassisted. He even engineered a kind of early irrigation system for the place small pipes fitted, with rose-shaped heads that misted the enclosure with fine droplets of water, keeping the whole operation properly moist the way a snail's comfort truly requires. Lipanus did not simply raise one kind of snail either. He kept different breeds carefully segregated by Penn's small white snails from his home region, enormous specimens imported from Illyria, and a particularly prized African variety famous for how easily it reproduced. Each type was fattened on its own careful formula, sometimes a mixture of flour and that same thick grape syrup we spent real time with earlier tonight. Sometimes plain milk instead poured into shallow dishes until the animals grew almost comically large. Pliny the Elder later claimed that some of Lipanus's prize snails swelled so large on this diet that they could no longer fit back inside their own shells, a detail that sounds like exaggeration, and quite honestly, probably was at least a little, though the underlying method behind it was completely real and well documented. Interestingly, not every Roman who loved snails wanted them piled onto some grand showy platter. Pliny, the younger nephew of the naturalist who recorded so much of this, once described treating a group of visiting friends to what he clearly considered an elegant, restrained little meal: a single lettuce leaf, a handful of eggs, some grains sweetened lightly with honey, and only 3 snails apiece. In a culture this obsessed with excess choosing, to serve only 3 snails deliberately was its own quiet kind of flex. A host confident enough in his own taste that he did not need to bury his guests in quantity to impress them. Can you imagine being the very first person in history to look at an ordinary garden snail and think with total confidence, I could turn this into a luxury export business? That is more or less exactly what Lipanus did, and by most accounts, he did it rather well. He is even said to have set up a private ferry service purely to import his favourite African snails, more efficiently treating shellfish logistics with the same seriousness a modern importer might bring to fine cheese or rare seafood. None of this stayed confined to one man's private hobby for long either. A wealthy landowner named Titus Pompeius, according to Varro, maintained a private hunting reserve stretching across roughly 4 square miles of land in Transalpine Gaul, an estate so enormous it comfortably held snail pens, rows of beehives and casks upon casks of confined dormice, all within the same property, alongside whatever larger game a guest might fancy hunting that afternoon. This was farm-to-table dining taken to its most extravagant possible extreme, an entire private ecosystem built and maintained for the sole purpose of eventually ending up one carefully fattened creature at a time on a dinner table. Imagine owning land so vast that an entire village of livestock beehives and specialty delicacies could sit tucked away inside a single corner of it barely worth mentioning next to the deer and wild boar roaming the rest of the property. Here is where I want to gently push back on a claim you will see repeated constantly across the internet, because I think the fuller picture matters more than a catchy headline. A great many articles love to declare with total confidence that Romans simply ate dormice, as though it were an everyday snack enjoyed by everyone from senators to street sweepers, the way we might casually reach for a handful of nuts on the couch. The honest evidence tells a narrower, more interesting story. This was a delicacy for the wealthy, expensive enough to attract an actual law, trying to ban it elaborate enough to require its own specialized jar, its own dedicated feeding schedule, its own careful presentation at the table. Most ordinary Romans, the soldiers and farmhands and shopkeepers we've already spent real time with tonight, almost certainly never tasted one in their entire lives, and would likely have found the whole idea a little baffling. A rich man's fuss over an animal they themselves might have simply chased out of a grain store with a broom. Treating dormice as some universal Roman comfort food flattens a much more interesting truth into a much less accurate headline, and honestly it undersells just how deliberately exclusive this particular delicacy was designed to feel. And here is a thought I keep circling back to because it refuses to leave me alone once I really sit with it. Somewhere in the modern world right now tonight, an animal is being deliberately confined and carefully fattened for exactly the same reason a dormouse once was to arrive at a table larger, richer, and more impressive than nature alone would have allowed. We have simply changed which creature and dressed the practice up in slightly more comfortable language. A duck raised for foie gras, a calf raised for the palest, most tender veal, a lobster kept alive in a tank at the front of a restaurant on display right up until the moment it becomes dinner. Have you ever really thought about what goes into the food labelled premium at a fine restaurant menu? The animal that spent its whole short life being prepared for one single elegant moment on somebody else's plate. Rome did not invent that particular impulse, chasing rarity, chasing spectacle, chasing the feeling of eating something few other people could afford to. It simply gave that impulse a very specific jar and a very particular name. The story does have a quieter, gentler afterlife worth knowing too, one that softens the whole tale a little before we move on. In parts of Slovenia today, hunting the edible dormouse remains an actual living tradition, passed down through families as a real piece of regional culture, rather than some distant historical curiosity locked safely behind a museum glass case, complete with its own seasonal customs and community gatherings built around the hunt. And that snail farming business Lipinus, more or less invented, never really stopped either. It simply crossed the centuries, drifted north into France, and eventually became escargot still served today, with the same basic confidence that a properly fattened, properly prepared snail deserves a seat at an elegant table garlic butter, standing in for the honey and grape syrup of an older world. The next time you see escargot listed proudly on a menu, you're looking directly at a 2,000-year-old Roman business plan, still working exactly as intended, quietly earning its keep across an entirely different continent and an entirely different language. But not every strange dish hiding inside that cookbook came from something quite this small or quite this easy to feel sentimental about once you understand where it came from. Some of what Roman cooks reach for next came from parts of much larger animals, the very same organs and cuts most modern kitchens quietly throw away without a second thought, treated instead as a real mark of skill in the kitchen, rather than something to hide. That is where we are headed next. Somewhere in a Roman kitchen, a cook stood over a cutting board covered in parts most of us would never think to call dinner organs and glands and cuts, with no elegant English name waiting nearby on a tray, and treated every single one of them like an opportunity rather than a problem to solve. Before refrigeration existed anywhere in the world, before a household could simply toss anything unwanted into a bin and forget about it, an animal that gave its life for the table represented a real investment, one that made very little sense to waste. Meat spoiled quickly sometimes within hours in the summer heat of an Italian afternoon. Ice was a luxury reserved for the mountains or a very wealthy household's private stores, carried down in blocks and packed carefully in straw, far beyond what an ordinary family could ever hope to afford. So when a pig, a cow or a lamb was slaughtered, a skilled Roman cook faced a simple practical choice made new with every single animal that passed through their hands. Either figure out how to use everything in front of them within the next day or two, or watch a meaningful portion of that investment quietly rot before anyone got the chance to eat it. Rome being Rome chose the first option, and then, with typical flair, decided to turn that plain necessity into an actual point of pride, a mark of a truly accomplished kitchen rather than a grim compromise forced onto a poor one. Blood deserves its own small mention here too, because it tends to surprise people almost as much as anything else on tonight's menu. Rather than letting it go to waste at the moment of slaughter, Roman cooks caught it carefully and worked it into rich dark sausages seasoned with pepper and herbs, sometimes bound with a little grain to give the mixture body. This was not some grim last resort measure either. Sausages made this way travelled well kept for a reasonably long stretch of time compared to fresh cuts, and became widely popular street food sold hot off a griddle to anyone hurrying past with a few coins to spare. If that sounds unfamiliar, consider that blood sausage never actually disappeared from human cooking at all. Britain still serves black pudding at breakfast without a second thought. Spain has morcilla, France has boudin noir, Korea has sundae. What Rome treated as ordinary, practical, everyday cooking, half the modern world is still quietly enjoying for breakfast this very morning, usually without any idea just how far back the tradition actually reaches. Now let's turn to the dish that tends to make modern audiences flinch the hardest of all, and I promise there is real history worth understanding underneath the initial reaction. So's womb, referred to in Latin as vulva, sat near the very top of the ancient Roman list of prized delicacies. The naturalist Pliny the Elder went so far as to say that no proper Roman banquet ever failed to include it, somewhere on the table, treating its absence as almost a social embarrassment. For the host, the kind of oversight guests would quietly notice and remember long after the evening ended. Romans even developed real sophisticated opinions about which version tasted best, the way a modern food lover might argue passionately over the merits of one cheese against another, or one vintage of wine over its neighbour from the very same hillside. Pliny himself preferred the womb of a sow that had never carried a litter, believing the texture stayed more delicate that way. The poet Martial, on the other hand, argued the opposite, insisting a womb from a sow that had already given birth carried a deeper, richer flavour worth seeking out specifically. This was not shock value dressed up centuries later to seem more dramatic than it actually was. This was an actual culinary debate conducted with a completely straight face among people who considered themselves serious connoisseurs, the ancient equivalent of arguing over which region produces the finest cut of a particular cheese. The cookbook attributed to Apicius backs this up with real specifics, offering 6 separate methods for preparing it. 4 recipes lean on pepper and fish sauce for their seasoning. 1 calls for grilling the meat after coating it in bran, then finishing it in a salty brine. Another turns it into something closer to a stuffed dumpling. 6 different recipes for a single cut of meat tells you plainly that this was never treated as an afterthought tossed into a pot out of desperation. It was treated as a true specialty deserving the same careful attention a modern chef might bring to a difficult prized cut of beef. Here is something worth noticing that quietly separates this particular chapter of Roman food history from almost everything else we have covered tonight. Dormice needed a special jar, months of careful feeding, and an entire small industry built around fattening them properly. Fish sauce needed weeks of patient fermenting under an open sky. But organs needed none of that special treatment. They came free with every single animal a household or a market butcher slaughtered, which meant this particular kind of resourceful cooking crossed every social class in Rome at once, unlike almost anything else on tonight's menu. A senator's private kitchen turned these ingredients into refined delicacies, worth writing careful recipes about. A cramped apartment with no proper kitchen of its own turned the very same ingredients into a simple dinner, bought cheaply from a local butcher, once the better, more expensive cuts had already been claimed by someone with deeper pockets, rich or poor. Almost nobody in Rome was a stranger to the inside of an animal. Udder followed right behind in reputation, particularly from a sow still producing milk at the time of slaughter, considered noticeably superior to udder taken from an animal that had already stopped nursing. A Greek physician named Oribasius, writing about food and health, centuries after these dishes first became fashionable, explained the appeal in strikingly simple terms, noting that these particular glands carried a trace of the sweetness of the milk still inside them, which is exactly why food lovers sought them out so eagerly, especially from sows in particular, above every other animal available to a Roman kitchen. Apicius offers his own elegant version of the dish, stuffing a whole udder with finely spiced ground sea urchin, sewing the opening carefully shut with needle and thread, cooking it slowly, and finishing the whole thing with a sharp, tangy mustard sauce right before serving. Doesn't that actually sound like something you might find on a seriously ambitious modern-tasting menu, dressed up in slightly fancier language, and served on a slate instead of a silver plate, with the server explaining the provenance of every ingredient in hushed reverent tones? Roman cooks did not stop at treating these ingredients individually either. They loved combining several delicacies into one single layered dish called a patina, something closer to what we might recognize today as a savory casserole, or honestly not too far removed from a lasagna sauce, and thin layers of dough alternating with rich fillings, stacked one on top of another, built up in a shallow dish and finished slowly over gentle heat. The most extravagant version recorded in the cookbook calls for cooked udder-flaked fish, tender chicken meat and the delicate breast meat of small songbirds, all folded together with instructions simply to add whatever finest ingredients happened to be available that particular day. It reads less like a fixed recipe and more like an invitation, a framework any confident cook could fill in with whatever excellence sat within reach, a structure built to showcase skill rather than measured precision. Here is a technique that might sound uncomfortably familiar if you have ever studied a modern menu closely. according to Pliny Apicius, is credited with a very particular method for preparing liver one that still echoes directly in professional kitchens today. He would feed a pig heavily on dried figs for a stretch of time, then give it as much honeyed wine as it would drink before having the animal slaughtered suddenly and without warning. The resulting liver, swollen and rich from all that feeding, was by every ancient account extraordinarily prized above almost any other single ingredient a kitchen could offer. If that entire process sounds familiar, it should. It is essentially an early ancestor of foie gras, the very same fattened liver still served today in fine restaurants across the world, produced through methods that remain deeply debated for exactly the same reasons they were remarkable 2,000 years ago. Rome did not invent the uncomfortable bargain at the centre of that dish, a little hardship placed on an animal in exchange for something spectacular on a plate. It simply left behind one of the oldest written records of somebody working out the recipe, and being honest enough, or perhaps simply unbothered enough to write down exactly how he did it. And this barely scratches the surface of what actually ended up on a well-stocked Roman table. Testicles, brains, tripe, kidneys, tongues, feet, tails, blood turned carefully into sausage, all of it sat comfortably within the accepted repertoire of a serious kitchen, treated the same way we might treat a difficult cut that rewards a cook who actually knows what they are doing. Brains in particular showed up constantly folded into stuffings, worked into sausages blended smooth into the base of a good patina, valued for the soft custard-like texture they brought to an otherwise heavy dish. Try naming 5 parts of a pig off the top of your head right now, honestly, without looking anything up. Most of us would struggle to get past the obvious cuts we already know from a supermarket aisle, which says quite a lot about how far our own relationship with meat has drifted from the animal it once was. Have you ever watched someone truly skilled turn an ingredient you would have thrown away into the best dish on the table, the one everyone quietly asks for the recipe of afterward? That is precisely the reputation a good Roman cook was chasing every single time they picked up a knife and looked at what remained after the obvious cuts had already been claimed by someone else. Here is where I think the fuller picture actually matters, because plenty of modern articles love to present all of this purely for shock value, treating it as proof that Romans were simply strange or extreme or somehow less refined than us. I would push back on that gently, because the opposite argument holds up just as well, and honestly it is happening again right now. In restaurants, people happily pay good money to eat at. A London chef named Fergus Henderson opened a restaurant called St. John back in the middle of the 1990s and built an entire reputation and a devoted following of chefs and diners stretching from London to New York and beyond, round exactly this same philosophy, using every single edible part of an animal rather than discarding what looks unfamiliar. His signature cookbook carries the title The Whole Beast, and his guiding idea, stated plainly right at the start of it, is that once an animal has given its life for the table, failing to make proper use of the whole creature would be a kind of quiet disrespect toward that sacrifice. Roasted bone marrow with parsley salad became his most famous dish, simple, rich, and built entirely around an ingredient most modern kitchens throw away without a second thought. Rome would have understood every word of that philosophy completely without needing a single sentence of it translated or explained. They were simply operating on the exact same logic, roughly 2,000 years earlier out of necessity rather than trend. So the real question worth sitting with tonight is not whether Roman taste was strange. It is why we decided somewhere along the way that only certain parts of an animal deserve a place at a proper table in the first place, while the rest quietly became something to apologize for or hide, or simply never mention out loud at dinner. A modern supermarket sells you a shrink-wrapped cut of meat with almost no visible connection left to the living creature it came from. Clean, anonymous, easy to forget the source of entirely wrapped in plastic under fluorescent light. A Roman cook worked with the whole animal, directly saw every part of it clearly from the very first cut, and built an entire cuisine around real respect for that completeness, rather than squeamishness toward it. I am not entirely convinced our version is actually the more sophisticated one, whatever we might tell ourselves, while reaching for another boneless, skinless cut wrapped in cellophane. It might simply be the version that has gotten better at looking away at a comfortable enough distance that we never have to think about where dinner actually came from before it arrived so neatly packaged. But even a civilization willing to use every last part of an animal still had certain ingredients they considered nearly irreplaceable, worth almost any price worth an emperor personally locking away a private stockpile of it in his own treasury. One particular plant fell into exactly that category, prized so completely, chased so relentlessly across every corner of its native coastline, that people eventually loved it directly into extinction, and then spent centuries afterwards simply trying to describe what it once tasted like to anyone who would listen. That is where we are headed next. One particular plant fell into exactly that category, and it deserves a proper introduction because almost nobody outside a classics department has ever heard its name, despite the fact that most of us have probably drawn its exact shape by hand at some point in our lives without ever knowing it. The Greeks called it silphion. The Romans called it silphium or sometimes laser, and for nearly 6 centuries it grew in exactly one place on the entire planet, a narrow strip of coastline near a city called Cyrene in what is now eastern Libya. Nowhere else. Not a few miles inland, not on a neighbouring hillside, not anywhere a hopeful farmer tried to transplant it, which, as we're about to see, quite a few of them did try and every single one of them failed. This single stubborn little plant became one of the most valuable commodities in the entire ancient world, treasured as a seasoning, treasured as a medicine, and treasured for a third reason we will get to shortly, one that turns out to connect directly to a symbol every single person watching tonight has drawn 1,000 times without giving it a second thought. According to the stories the Greeks told about it, silphium arrived as a gift from the god. Apollo himself discovered not long after settlers from the island of Thera first founded Cyrene sometime around the middle of the 7th century, before the Common Era arriving suddenly almost mysteriously along a stretch of coast where nobody remembered seeing it before. Whatever the real botanical explanation actually was, the plant seemed to grow only in that specific stretch of soil and climate tucked between the sea and the desert, and nowhere else humans ever managed to coax it into taking root no matter how badly they wanted to. As a seasoning, it apparently tasted something like a cross between garlic onion and a sharper, more pungent herb we have already met tonight, strong enough that a small amount changed an entire dish, which made it wildly popular across Greek and Roman kitchens alike. As a medicine, its reputation bordered on the miraculous. Ancient writers credited it with soothing coughs, settling upset stomachs, treating snake bites, and easing symptoms of what we would now recognize as epilepsy. Pliny the Elder, never shy about praising a good natural remedy, called it one of nature's most valuable gifts to humankind, a statement he did not make lightly about very many plants at all. Can you think of a single modern ingredient that manages to be a beloved spice, a trusted medicine, and a real cultural obsession all rolled into one at the exact same time? We simply do not have an equivalent left in our kitchens today, which makes the scale of this particular loss a little easier to appreciate. And because of all this, silphium became truly seriously expensive. Ancient writers described it as worth its weight in silver, and Cyrene, the one city on Earth that controlled the only reliable supply of it, grew extraordinarily wealthy simply by sitting on top of the right patch of coastline. The city was proud enough of this plant to stamp its image directly onto its own currency coin after coin showing the thick ridged stalk or the distinctive seed pod sitting at its base, a small piece of botanical branding that outlasted the plant itself by thousands of years. If you have never seen one of these ancient Cyrenian coins, I want you to picture the seed pod for a moment before I tell you what it actually looked like, rounded at the top, curving inward toward a narrow point at the bottom. In other words, if you are picturing a heart shape right now in the exact way we still draw hearts on birthday cards and text messages today, you are picturing it correctly. Here is where this story caught me off guard the first time I properly looked into it. A number of historians studying ancient symbolism now believe that our modern hearts shape the ones stamped onto candy boxes and typed out as an emoji 100 times a day across the world may trace directly back to this exact seed pod, immortalized on Cyrenian coins roughly 2,500 years ago. The connection makes a strange kind of sense once you understand what silphium was actually famous for beyond cooking and medicine. Ancient writers widely believed it worked as an effective contraceptive and possibly as an early form of what we would now call an abortion-inducing herb, as well taken by women across the Mediterranean world who wanted some measure of control over their own reproductive lives in an era that otherwise offered them very little. The Roman poet Catullus even worked a wink toward it directly into one of his poems, telling his lover he wanted as many kisses from her as there are grains of sand lying in silphium bearing Cyrene a line that lands rather differently once you know exactly what silphium was actually used for behind closed doors. So that little heart shape you doodle in the margin of a notebook or send in a text message without thinking twice about it may have started life as a discreet, widely recognized symbol for reproductive control, centuries before it ever meant romance at all. Isn't it strange how thoroughly history can launder a symbol's original meaning until almost nobody left alive even remembers where it actually came from? Given all of that, it should not surprise you that Rome eventually decided this particular plant was simply too valuable to leave in private hands. Julius Caesar personally ordered a substantial stockpile of silphium resin locked away inside the state treasury itself, alongside gold and silver reserves, treating it as a real strategic asset rather than a simple kitchen spice, something closer to a national reserve than a seasoning rack. Later, the Emperor Augustus went a step further, still demanding that all silphium harvested from Cyrene be sent directly to him as a form of tribute, effectively nationalizing the entire supply chain of a single wild plant-cutting private merchants out of a trade that had once made ordinary Cyrenian families wealthy in their own right. Imagine an emperor caring so much about one specific plant that he rewrote the rules of an entire regional economy just to control it more tightly. Naturally, everyone wanted to grow more of it, and naturally almost nobody could. The physician Hippocrates himself reportedly tried twice attempting to transplant silphium from Cyrene to Athens, using every trick of soil and cultivation available to a serious student of the natural world, and failed both times. Modern botanists studying the surviving descriptions believe the plant may have required an unusually specific combination of soil, chemistry, rainfall, and growing season, the kind of narrow window nature sometimes builds into a single stubborn species, without any regard for how badly humans might want to bottle it up and carry it home. Some researchers even suspect the plant needed a particular relationship with the local wild insects for pollination, something no transplanted specimen, no matter how carefully tended, could ever fully recreate outside its native coastline. Every failed attempt to cultivate silphium elsewhere only drove the price higher, and the pressure on that one small stretch of Libyan coastline heavier, because a plant nobody could farm could only ever be gathered from the wild faster than it could possibly regrow on its own, and that in the end is almost certainly what killed it. Overharvesting driven by demand that never once slowed down across hundreds of years, made considerably worse by local farmers renting out the same coastal land to graze sheep and goats animals that happily chewed through young silphium shoots before they ever had the chance to mature and reseed the ground around them. Every generation wanted its share, and every generation assumed quietly, without ever really examining the assumption that there would always be more silphium waiting along that same stretch of coastline the following season. By the time Pliny the Elder sat down to write his great encyclopedia of the natural world, sometime in the 7th decade of the 1st century, he recorded with something bordering on real sadness in the writing that only a single stalk of wild silphium had been found in living memory, and that stalk had already been sent as a curiosity, a strange and precious oddity, straight to the Emperor Nero. After that single stalk, no reliable historical source ever mentions finding another one again anywhere ever. Silphium is now widely considered one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented examples, in all of recorded history, of a species harvested directly into extinction by human demand, centuries before anyone had a word for what that even meant, let alone the scientific tools to see it coming in time to stop it. Once the real thing became impossible to find, Roman cooks reached for the closest available substitute, a related similarly pungent resin called asafoetida, imported at real expense all the way from further east, carried along trade routes that stretched deep into Persia and beyond. If that word laser has been quietly floating around in the background of tonight's story without much explanation, here is finally where it clicks into place. That pungent seasoning tucked into the stuffed dormouse recipe earlier tonight. The one flavouring several other dishes we've already walked through together was this exact ingredient, either true silphium, while any of it could still be found, or its humbler substitute once the real thing had vanished for good, quietly standing in for a flavour. Most Roman cooks working later in the empire's history had never once tasted in its original form. Apicius even left behind a clever little trick for stretching a small, precious supply as far as it could possibly go, storing a single piece of silphium inside an airtight jar together with pine nuts, letting the nuts slowly absorb its scent and flavour over time, so that a cook running low on the real thing could crumble a few flavoured pine nuts into a dish instead, and still capture something remarkably near the original taste. A small act of culinary rationing dressed up as a clever trick. Even at the absolute edge of scarcity, Roman kitchens found a way to make a legend stretch a little further one borrowed pine nut at a time. Here is a strange, hopeful little postscript to leave you with before we move on tonight. In recent years, a researcher working in central Turkey, hundreds of miles from Cyrene's original coastline, has proposed that a rare, slow-growing plant called Ferula druidiana, found in only a handful of isolated mountain locations, might actually be silphium itself, somehow surviving all this time in an unexpected corner of the ancient world nobody thought to look. The similarities are strikingly real, matching leaf patterns visible on the old Cyrenian coins, similar medicinal compounds showing anti-inflammatory and contraceptive properties in early testing, and even local shepherds reporting that their animals seek the plant out the exact same way. Ancient sources once described sheep and goats behaving around silphium. Other scientists remain considerably more cautious about the claim, pointing out that genetic studies suggest this particular Turkish plant likely evolved locally over a very long stretch of time with no clear ancient connection, stretching back to North Africa at all, which makes the geography of the whole theory difficult to fully explain. The truth is we may never know for certain, and might never have the specimens needed to settle the question with real confidence either way. But there is something quietly moving about the fact that people are still searching for this plant 2,000 years after it supposedly disappeared, still hoping the story does not have to end permanently in a museum coin and a single stalk handed to an emperor who likely never gave it a second thought once the moment had passed. Have you ever thought about how many things we assume are permanent simply because they have always been available in our own lifetime? Silphium was not rare because nobody wanted it. It went extinct precisely because everybody did all at once for centuries, until the plant itself simply could not keep pace with its own popularity spent faster than it could ever hope to regrow. We tend to think of extinction as a modern crisis, something that belongs to smokestacks and plastic and satellite images of shrinking ice. But the underlying pattern is considerably older than any of that, and considerably more human than we might like to admit. A resource seems endless, right up until the exact moment it is gone, and by the time anyone notices the shift, clearly enough to act, the last stalk has usually already been cut, wrapped up and handed off as a curiosity to whoever happened to be standing closest at the time. That is a strange, quietly unsettling thought to carry into the rest of tonight's story, especially the next chapter, which is about another ingredient Rome loved so completely that entire fleets of ships were built and sent across open ocean again and again, purely to keep the supply flowing no matter the distance, no matter the cost. That is where we are headed next. Another ingredient earns that particular honour tonight, and unlike almost everything else we have talked about so far, this one never smelled strange, never came from an unexpected part of an animal, and never needed a single jar or vat to prepare. It simply had to travel an almost unbelievable distance to reach a Roman table, crossing an ocean most Romans back home could not have pointed to on a map, and Rome, it turns out, was more than willing to pay for that distance year after year no matter the cost. We're talking about pepper. Plain ordinary, sitting in a shaker on almost every table in the modern world without anyone giving it a second thought. Refilled at a grocery store for pocket change whenever it runs low, sitting quietly next to salt, as though the two had always been equals. In ancient Rome, a small handful of these dried berries represented one of the most valuable, most fought-over trade goods on the entire planet, arriving after a journey that makes even the garum shipments we talked about earlier tonight look almost local by comparison. One travelled a few days along familiar coastline, the other crossed open water. Most Roman sailors had never dared attempt a generation earlier, chasing a wind pattern nobody in Rome fully understood until fairly late in the story. Here is where that journey actually began. Egyptian ports along the Red Sea, places called Myos Hormuz, and Berenice sent ships south each summer, timed carefully to catch a very particular pattern of seasonal wind that could carry a vessel straight across open ocean toward the coast of southern India, rather than the slow, cautious route of hugging the coastline the entire way, which could take the better part of 2 years to complete round trip. Roman and Greek writers credited a navigator named Hippolus with working out how to use this wind reliably for a direct Roman crossing, and that particular seasonal wind even carried his name for a while afterward. It is worth saying plainly, though, that sailors from southern Arabia and the Indian coast itself had almost certainly been reading these same winds for generations before any Roman ship ever attempted the crossing. What Hippolus really deserves credit for is convincing Rome to trust a route that people much closer to it had already understood for a very long time. Once a ship caught that wind correctly, the open ocean crossing itself took around 40 days, arriving at a bustling trade port on India's southwestern coast called Muziris, where local merchants waited with warehouses full of pepper gems and fine cloth, ready to trade for Roman gold and silver coin. A full round trip, including the wait for the return wind months later, could stretch out to nearly a full year from start to finish. And Rome sent an enormous number of ships to make that exact journey, despite very real dangers waiting along the way. Pliny himself noted that these trading vessels carried companies of armed archers on board a standing defence against pirates who understood exactly how valuable a single ship's cargo had become, and who had every incentive in the world to try their luck against a slow, heavily loaded merchant vessel, far from any Roman patrol. The geographer Strabo reported that as many as 120 vessels sailed out from a single Egyptian port in a single season, all chasing the same handful of goods, pepper chief among them, all willing to risk storms, pirates and months at sea for a cargo that would eventually end up sprinkled over dinner without a second thought back home. Now here is something worth clearing up, because it tends to surprise people who assume pepper was always just pepper, one single uniform product like it mostly is today. Ancient Rome actually prized two distinctly different kinds: long pepper, a spicier, more pungent variety grown further north in India, and black pepper, the milder, more familiar kind that dominates our own kitchens today. According to Pliny, the elder's own price records, long pepper cost roughly 15 denarii per pound, white pepper around 7, and plain black pepper closer to 4, meaning the sharper, harder to find variety commanded nearly quadruple the price of the pepper we now consider entirely ordinary, barely worth mentioning on a grocery receipt. Have you ever paid extra for the spicier version of something at a restaurant purely for bragging rights among your friends, purely to say you could handle it? Wealthy Romans were doing exactly that, just with considerably higher stakes attached to the bill, and considerably more status riding on the choice. Pliny himself, to his credit, could not quite let the whole obsession pass without a bit of pointed commentary, and I happen to love him a little more for it every time I revisit this particular passage. He wondered aloud in his own writing why pepper had become so fashionable, at all pointing out that unlike fruit or grain, it offered absolutely nothing appealing about its appearance, nothing sweet about its taste, nothing except a sharp biting sensation on the tongue, and yet an entire empire had decided that single fleeting sensation was worth sailing all the way to India to obtain again and again, year after year, without ever once questioning the habit out loud. It is a wonderfully grumpy observation from a man surrounded by his own countrymen's spending habits, and honestly it still lands today, does it not? Pepper contains no real nutrition to speak of. It does not fill a stomach or cure an illness, or preserve a piece of meat especially well, despite what popular legend sometimes claims about spices masking spoiled food. Rome crossed an ocean again and again purely to feel something sharp on the tongue for a few seconds at dinner, and called that pursuit entirely reasonable. The scale of this obsession eventually demanded its own dedicated infrastructure, the kind normally reserved for grain or gold rather than something so easily poured into a small clay jar. Under the emperor, Domitian, Rome built special warehouses known as the Horia Piperataria. Entire buildings constructed purely to store imported pepper and other eastern spices, carefully organized, guarded and inventoried, an entire wing of the imperial economy built around organizing and protecting sacks of dried berries as though they were bullion. Imagine convincing an emperor that a spice needed its own government-funded storage facility staffed and secured like a treasury, and having him agree without much argument at all, simply because the numbers involved had grown too large to leave sitting in a merchant's back room. We do not have to rely purely on complaints and price lists to understand the scale of this trade, either because a remarkably detailed document survives that lays it out in stark financial detail, the kind of primary source historians dream about finding intact. Historians call it the Muserus Papyrus, a fragile scrap of paper recovered from the sands of Egypt, recording the actual cargo and contract details for a single trading ship named the Hermopollon, right down to the individual goods sitting in its hold. According to the surviving figures, that one ship alone carried well over 500 tons of pepper on a single voyage, alongside smaller quantities of ivory tortoiseshell and other prized eastern goods packed carefully into a hull built specifically to survive that long open ocean crossing. The total value of just 3/4 of that single cargo came to somewhere near 9 million sesterces, a sum roughly equivalent to owning a fine private estate back in Italy, 7 times over the wealth a man legally needed simply to qualify for a seat in the Roman Senate. Sit with that comparison for a second. One ship, one voyage. More wealth sitting quietly in its hold, mostly as dried pepper, than most Roman families would see across several entire lifetimes combined. And this was apparently not even considered an especially unusual shipment for the route. No wonder Pliny, writing with a mixture of admiration and real economic anxiety, complained that there was not a single year in which India failed to drain the Roman Empire of somewhere around 50 million sesterces wealth, flowing steadily eastward across the ocean, in exchange for pepper, silk and precious stones never to return, gone for good, the moment a Roman ship handed over its gold. Does that number sound familiar at all? It should in spirit, if not in exact figure, because we still hear versions of this same worried complaint today whenever someone points out how much of a modern nation's wealth flows overseas in exchange for goods nobody can easily produce at home. 2,000 years apart, and the same basic anxiety keeps resurfacing in slightly different clothing. Worried politicians and worried naturalists alike watching gold sail away in exchange for something that will not last the season. Here is the detail that turns this entire story from an economic curiosity into something considerably sharper, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before we move on tonight, because it may be the single most striking fact in this entire chapter. Centuries later, as the western half of the Roman Empire crumbled under real undeniable military pressure, a Visigothic king named Alaric marched his army to the very walls of Rome itself and demanded an enormous ransom in exchange for sparing the city from destruction. The list of demands survives in the historical record, and it reads like an inventory of everything Rome still considered precious, even as its power visibly collapsed around it. Gold, silver, fine silk garments dyed a rare, extraordinarily expensive purple, the kind reserved for emperors and their closest circle, and quite specifically 3,000 pounds of pepper. Think about what that actually means for a moment, turning it over slowly in your mind. In the final, desperate negotiations to save the city that once ruled most of the known world, pepper sat listed alongside literal gold and silver as an acceptable form of tribute valuable enough to help buy off an invading army at the absolute end of an empire's long story. The same small sharp berry that Pliny once mocked for having no real value beyond its bite had become, by the time Rome truly needed it, a real form of currency in its own right, trusted by a foreign king who had never once set foot inside a Roman dining room. So why did an entire civilization organize fleets, warehouses, and government policy around a spice with zero nutritional value, offering nothing but a fleeting sharp sensation on the tongue? I think the honest answer says less about pepper itself and more about something deeply stubbornly human, something that has never really gone away in 2,000 years. We've always been willing to pay extraordinary amounts for pure sensation, for the specific wordless thrill of tasting something rare that most people around us will never get to try, or affording something scarce simply because scarcity itself feels like a kind of proof. Status dressed up as flavor. Rome simply had the ships, the money and the appetite to chase that particular thrill further than almost anyone else in the ancient world, all the way across an ocean and back again every single season. And here is the strange quiet irony sitting at the very end of this story, one worth carrying with you tonight, especially after everything we learned earlier about a certain vanished plant. Pepper never went the way of silphium. It never disappeared, never became a museum curiosity handed to a single emperor as the last surviving stalk of something extraordinary. Instead, once trade routes expanded and supply finally caught up with centuries of relentless demand, pepper simply became ordinary, common, almost invisible, sitting in a cheap shaker on every table in the modern world, refilled without a second thought, tossed onto a plate by people with absolutely no idea that a Visigothic king once accepted it as a legitimate substitute for gold at the gates of a dying empire. Isn't that a strange kind of ending for an ingredient that once helped ransom the most powerful city on earth? The exact same berry that helped save Rome for a little while longer now sits quietly next to the salt, waiting for someone to reach for it purely out of habit, rather than desire, rather than status, rather than the memory of every ship that once crossed an ocean just to bring a little of it home. But status, as we're about to see, could take a far stranger, far more theatrical shape than a warehouse full of imported spice. Sometimes it meant staging an entire performance at your own dinner table, one so elaborate, so deliberately over the top, that later generations could not quite decide whether to laugh at it or take it as a serious warning about exactly where all of this excess was always headed. That is where we are headed next. The performance in question survives in a battered, incomplete novel, written by a man who spent his days sleeping off the previous night's excess, and his evenings deep inside the strangest, most decadent circles Roman high society had to offer a man Emperor Nero himself trusted enough to name his personal judge of taste, the one courtier whose opinion on elegance and refinement carried more weight than almost anyone else at court. His name was Gaius Petronius, and the book he left behind is called the Satyricon, a wild, sprawling satire following a pair of small-time con artists as they drift through the sleazier corners of southern Italy, tangled in petty schemes, failed seductions and one disastrous social climb after another. Most of that original book has been lost to time, completely scattered and destroyed across the centuries the way so much ancient writing simply was. But one long section survived almost intact, preserved separately by medieval copyists, who apparently found it too entertaining to let disappear, and it happens to be a dinner party. Specifically, the single most extravagant, most theatrically absurd dinner party in the whole of surviving Roman literature, hosted by a fictional former slave named Trimalchio, a man so wildly aggressively rich that even Rome, a city that had already seen a silver shield loaded with flamingo tongue, apparently still found something worth laughing at in him. Our two narrators, a pair of penniless students looking for a free meal, talk their way into Trimalchio's house, expecting an ordinary dinner. What they get instead is somewhere between a banquet and a circus, narrated with the kind of exhausted, slightly horrified fascination anyone might feel watching a wealthy stranger's party spiral gloriously out of control in real time. They meet their host first at the baths being oiled and scrubbed, not with ordinary linen towels, but with the finest wool available, while a trio of messieurs sit nearby drinking his best imported wine so carelessly that Trimalchio jokes they are simply drinking to his health. He arrives at his own front door, carried in a litter wrapped in scarlet, felt trailed by a small orchestra playing music directly into his ear, the entire way as though silence for even a few minutes might actually kill him. Painted on the wall of his own entrance hall for every guest to admire on the way inside is his complete life story, rendered in careful, loving detail. A slave auction. This god Mercury personally guiding him towards success. His slow climb from household slave to trusted steward, and finally to fabulously wealthy freedman. Have you ever met someone who could not stop talking about how far they had come? Trimalchio had that same energy permanently painted onto his own walls, for anyone entering his home to absorb before they had even taken their first sip of wine. The food itself arrives less like a meal and more like a magic show performed course by course, each dish designed to provoke a gasp or a laugh before a single bite is taken. A bronze donkey carries 2 baskets on its back, one filled with white olives, one with black. A wide serving dish painted to represent the 12 signs of the heavens holds a small matching delicacy resting over each one. Chickpeas resting under Aries, a cut of beef under Taurus, a pair of kidneys standing in for the twins of Gemini, a single crab tucked beneath Cancer, arranged with the kind of careful cleverness that clearly took someone real thought and effort to design a menu built like a riddle guests were meant to solve course by course. And you will remember the honeyed dormice from earlier tonight balanced on their tiny decorative bridges. This exact dinner is where that particular detail actually comes from one small course inside a much larger, much stranger evening that never once slowed down long enough to let its guests catch their breath. Then comes the wild boar presented whole, wearing what looks unmistakably like the soft felt cap given to newly freed slaves. Nobody at the table understands the joke until a servant explains it patiently. This exact boar had been served once before at yesterday's dinner, then sent away uneaten, and so today it returns to the table as a freedman exactly the way Trimalchio himself once did. When the carving finally begins, a hunting knife slices into the animal's side, and instead of simple roasted meat, a flock of small living birds bursts out and scatters across the dining room, while trained handlers stand ready with nets to catch them mid-escape. Guests who had ordered what they assumed would be pastry stuffed with peahen eggs discover mid-bite that the eggs are not eggs at all, but delicate pastry shells hiding a small spice songbird inside each one. Nothing at this table is ever quite what it first appears to be, and that it slowly becomes clear is precisely the entire point of the evening. At one particularly strange moment, a servant flings a small silver skeleton down onto the table itself, its jointed limbs clattering loosely across the plates. Trimalchio, delighted rather than disturbed, recites a short, cheerful little verse about how little any of us really are in the end, so we might as well enjoy ourselves while we still can. It is a startling image to picture clearly a wealthy half-drunk host waving a tiny skeleton around at his own dinner party, while quoting something bordering on ancient philosophy at his baffled guests purely for the theatre of it. Here is my favourite trick of the entire evening, and I think it says more about Trimalchio's character than almost anything else we've covered tonight. A whole roasted pig arrives at the table, and Trimalchio, staring at it with sudden mock outrage, announces that the cook has forgotten to remove its insides before cooking it, an unthinkable, punishable mistake. The cook is dragged out, terrified, ordered to strip off his tunic right there in front of everyone as though real punishment is about to follow. Guests playing along with the performance, or perhaps truly alarmed, beg for mercy on the poor man's behalf. Trimalchio relents dramatically, and instead hands the cook a knife, ordering him to gut the pig properly right there at the table in front of the entire party. The moment the blade goes in, sausages and rich blood puddings come tumbling out through the opening, already fully cooked and perfectly seasoned, and the whole room bursts into applause. The pig was never forgotten at all. It had been carefully, deliberately stuffed ahead of time purely to stage a small piece of dinner theatre, complete with false jeopardy and a happy, delicious ending. Trimalchio had built an entire fake crisis into his menu, purely so his guests could enjoy watching it resolve, and Trimalchio could not stop talking not for a moment about the sheer scale of everything he personally owned. He boasted that the wool on his own back came entirely from his own estates. The citrus on his own table grew in his own private orchards. Even the pepper we spent real time with earlier tonight supposedly came somehow from land. He personally controlled an impossible claim, given how far apart these products actually needed to grow in the real world. He bragged about sending all the way to India simply to acquire mushroom spores for his own gardens, treating an entire ocean crossing as barely worth mentioning next to his other accomplishments. When a guest admired one of his bronze cups, Trimalchio cut in immediately to insist that he alone out of everyone present owned the real thing true. Corinthian bronze, the good stuff, as though authenticity itself was simply one more possession to collect and display for an audience. But the evening's true centerpiece, its strange, uncomfortable emotional climax, comes when Trimalchio decides, apparently on a whim, to stage a full rehearsal of his own funeral right there in the middle of his own dinner party. He calls for his burial shroud. He arranges himself dramatically among the cushions, instructing his musicians to imagine he has actually died, and play something appropriately mournful in his honour. The household trumpeters, taking the assignment perhaps a little too seriously, blast out a funeral march with such tremendous unrestrained volume that the neighbours and eventually the city guards themselves assume the house must actually be on fire. Guards break down the door with axes ready to fight flames that do not exist, and in all the resulting confusion and shouting our two exhausted narrators finally slip out into the street unnoticed, grateful beyond words simply to be free of the whole spectacle at last. Scholars have spent a very long time arguing over what exactly Petronius meant by all of this, and honestly I do not think we need to settle the debate completely tonight to enjoy it properly. Some interpret it as a pointed moralizing warning about where unchecked wealth eventually leads a person. Others see it as pure class anxiety, dressed up as comedy, old aristocratic Rome, quietly mocking a rising class of freedmen who had grown rich and powerful faster than anyone comfortable with the old order really wanted to accept. And some scholars simply believe Petronius found the whole situation funny, full stop, with no larger lesson buried underneath it at all, content to let a thoroughly absurd character be exactly as absurd as he wanted purely for the pleasure of watching him perform. Here is a detail I love sharing because it tends to catch even people who studied literature in school completely off guard. When the American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald first drafted the book we now know as The Great Gatsby, he was seriously considering an entirely different title for it, one he actually used in his own private letters and early manuscript pages before his editor eventually talked him out of it: Trimalchio. He saw the exact same pattern sitting inside his own story, a man who had climbed from nothing, throwing wildly extravagant parties, purely to be noticed, purely to prove something to people who would never fully accept him, regardless of how much he spent trying to impress them. Think about that connection for a moment, two writers separated by nearly 2,000 years, reaching independently for the exact same shape of person, to tell essentially the exact same story. A grand house, a crowd of guests who barely know their host, a pile of wealth built to answer a question that money alone was never actually going to solve. 2,000 years apart, and writers kept independently reaching for the exact same character, because apparently we have never once stopped producing him generation after generation in every century that ever discovered new money and old resentment sitting uncomfortably at the same table. That resentment was not simply an abstract literary theme in Petronius's own lifetime either. Rome in the years just before and during Nero's reign watched a number of former slaves rise into truly enormous political power, trusted advisors managing the empire's finances and administration, wielding real influence that traditional senators felt should have belonged to them by birth, rather than to a freedman by talent or simple good fortune. Trimalchio, ridiculous as he is on the page, channels a very real, very current anxiety. Petronius's own readers would have recognized instantly at their own dinner tables the uncomfortable sense that the old rules about who deserved wealth and status no longer applied quite the way they used to. And here is where the story turns quietly tragic in a way that recontextualizes everything we just walked through together tonight. Not very long after writing all of this, Petronius fell out of favor at Nero's court, accused likely unfairly of plotting against the emperor himself, caught up in the same paranoid purges that claimed several other prominent Romans during that particular stretch of Nero's reign. Rather than wait to be formally executed, he chose to take his own life, but even in his final hours, according to the historian Tacitus, he refused to perform the solemn philosophical death Roman tradition expected of a condemned nobleman, the dignified farewell speech, the calm meditation on the immortality of the soul. He opened his veins slowly, then had them bound up again whenever he felt like resting, spending his last evening listening to light poetry and casual conversation among friends, rather than serious meditations on mortality, treating even his own imperially ordered death as one final quiet joke aimed squarely at the court that demanded it of him. The man who wrote an entire dinner party built around the fear of not having lived enough spent his own final night refusing to take his forced ending seriously at all, denying Nero even the satisfaction of a properly sombre execution. So maybe that is the real quiet lesson sitting underneath all that gold and roast pig and painted wall murals tonight. Excess has always frightened the people watching it from just outside the dining room, whether they admit that fear openly or dress it up as satire instead. Safer to laugh at a fictional glutton than to examine what exactly they themselves are afraid of losing. And sometimes the person laughing loudest at somebody else's spectacle is standing closer to his own falling knife than anyone at the table realizes, including himself, right up until the moment the laughter stops for good. But not every Roman feast we still remember was fictional satire dressed up as comedy, safely distanced behind the page of a novel. Some of the most extravagant, most disturbing displays of excess in Roman history were entirely thoroughly real, documented by serious historians, rather than invented by a novelist, hosted by men who actually held the power to make good on every single one of their appetites, with nobody left standing near enough to tell them no. That is where we are headed next. Let's go back for a moment to that silver shield we started this whole night with, because there is a piece of that story I deliberately left sitting in the dark, saved for exactly this moment. For a very long time, historians simply repeated what Vitellius's enemies wrote about him, and took it more or less at face value. A greedy, lazy man who built a platter out of flamingo tongues purely because he could not control his own appetite. It made for a tidy, satisfying story, the kind that fits neatly into a single sentence and never gets questioned again. But a group of scholars studying that same shield more closely in recent years have started asking a sharper, more interesting question. What if the whole point of that platter was never really about hunger at all? Look again at the name Vitellius chose for it, the Shield of Minerva. Not just any goddess, but specifically the goddess of war, and just as importantly the goddess of skilled craft and clever strategy, the deity Romans turned to when they wanted to signal intelligence rather than simple brute force. Researchers examining this connection have pointed out that every single ingredient piled onto that silver surface had been gathered from opposite ends of the known world, from the eastern frontier near Parthia, all the way to the western edge of the empire near Spain. Reassembled together, that platter was not simply a monument to greed. It was a message delivered in food instead of words, announcing that the entire empire, every distant province, every hard-won frontier answered to the man hosting this particular dinner. A shield, after all, is not just something you hide behind. It is something you carry into battle to be seen by everyone watching. Here is a small technical detail that never quite made it into most retellings, and I think it deserves a moment of its own. The physician Galen, writing not long after these events, noted that flamingo tongue was rarely served entirely on its own, cleaned down to nothing but muscle. Skilled cooks generally left a portion of the surrounding tissue attached, because the visible tip of the tongue alone carried very little actual meat to speak of. In other words, even this most infamous, most mocked ingredient in all of Roman cuisine required real technical understanding to prepare properly the kind of small culinary detail lost entirely once a dish becomes shorthand for excess rather than an actual thing somebody in a kitchen had to figure out how to cook well. None of this rewrites Vitellius into some misunderstood genius, and I want to be careful not to overcorrect in the other direction either. He was still, by every credible account, a man who let his soldiers run wild through Rome, who spent staggering sums while an empire quietly slid towards civil war around him. But the fuller picture matters. Some of what history remembers as pure, mindless gluttony may have actually been a calculated performance of power, crafted by a man who understood exactly what message a well-designed plate of food could send to a room full of people deciding in real time whether he deserved to keep his throne. History, written by the winning side, rarely bothers to record that kind of nuance. Vespasian's supporters had every reason to paint their predecessor as a simple glutton, rather than a man playing a serious calculated game with the resources available to him. If Vitellius represents excess with at least some strategy hiding underneath it, our next figure tonight represents something considerably harder to defend, though here too the full story turns out to be more complicated than the legend that survived him. His name before the world decided to remember him only by the god he worshipped was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He became emperor of Rome at only 14 years old, ruling under the adopted name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, though history simply calls him Elagabalus today, after the Syrian sun god he served as high priest before ever setting foot in Rome. His reign lasted barely 4 years before his own guards turned on him, and almost everything we think we know about him comes from a single collection of imperial biographies written generations later by an author whose real identity remains truly uncertain even now. That source, sensationalist by its very nature, freely admits its own author never really wanted to write the account at all, and modern historians treat many of its wilder claims with considerable well-earned suspicion, aware that a foreign-born teenage emperor who imposed his own Eastern religion on Rome made an unusually convenient villain for writers eager to please whichever dynasty came next. Even filtered carefully through that skepticism, though the stories that survive about his dinner parties are worth hearing tonight, if only because they push the theatrical instincts we already saw at Trimalchio's fictional table into something considerably darker and more real. Elagabalus reportedly delighted in serving certain guests the ones he liked. Lease plates piled with food made entirely of waxwood or polished stone dressed up, to look exactly like the real delicacies everyone else at the table was actually eating, convincing enough that a guest might not realize the trick until the fork hit solid material instead of food. Other accounts describe entire banquets built around a single color theme, every dish for the evening arriving in matching shades of green or blue or gold, purely for the visual spectacle of it turning dinner into something closer to a piece of installation art than a meal meant to be eaten and enjoyed. He's even said to have once offered a prize of fine silk clothing to any guest clever enough to invent an entirely new sauce, impressive enough to win his approval, treating his own dinner table as a standing competition, rather than a simple meal shared among friends. Can you imagine sitting down to dinner at that particular house, never quite certain whether the plate in front of you was real, or simply another elaborate joke at your expense? The most famous story attached to his name involves flowers rather than food, and I want to handle it with a little care because popular retellings have inflated it considerably over the centuries, the way a good story so often grows larger with each new person who repeats it. According to that same shaky historical source, Elagabalus once released such an overwhelming volume of loose flower petals down onto his dinner guests from a false ceiling above the room that several of them reportedly struggled to breathe under the sheer weight and volume of it, caught completely off guard by a spectacle disguised as a gift. Later, far less careful retellings turn this into guests being smothered to death, outright a dramatic flourish. The earliest surviving account never actually claims, though it has certainly made for a striking painting or two in the centuries since. Even in its more modest original form, though, the image says something worth sitting with. A young emperor who had access to nearly unlimited resources and apparently very little understanding of where entertainment ended, and real harm toward the people around him, began mistaking overwhelming spectacle for real generosity. So here is what I keep coming back to, turning both of these stories over side by side tonight, one about a shield and one about a shower of flowers. Extreme power, it turns out, does not just corrupt what a person eats. It corrupts what a person considers an acceptable thing to do to the people sharing a meal with them, whether that means turning a dinner into political theatre or turning it into a joke with real breathing victims. And the historians who wrote both stories down afterward were rarely neutral witnesses either, each one carrying their own reasons to make a fallen emperor look as monstrous or as ridiculous as the moment required writing. For readers who had every incentive to believe the very worst about whoever had just lost the throne, the truth as usual probably sits somewhere quieter and more human than either the ancient gossip or the modern headline ever fully allows, caught permanently between two versions of a story neither side had much reason to tell honestly. Before we shut the door on this particular kitchen tonight, I want to leave you with something warmer, something that survived far more gently than any silver shield or shower of flower petals ever did. Buried inside that same strange borrowed cookbook we spent real time with earlier tonight, sits a small humble little recipe called alita dulcia, meaning simply another sweet dish tucked quietly among far more extravagant instructions for peacock and flamingo and stuffed dormice. Slices of good white bread crusts removed soaked in milk and beaten egg fried gently in oil and finished with a drizzle of honey before serving. Picture that instruction for a moment and tell me it does not sound exactly like a plate of French toast sitting in front of you on a lazy weekend morning. That is because it essentially is. This exact technique travelled forward through the centuries, showing up in medieval England as something called pain perdu lost bread, a clever way of rescuing stale loaves that would otherwise go to waste, and in German kitchens as Armritter, poor knight's toast, a dish built to let ordinary people eat something that felt a little like luxury on an otherwise plain morning before eventually settling into the sweet familiar breakfast. So many of us will eat again this very week without a second thought about where it actually came from. Somewhere underneath the silver shields and the flying flower petals and the flamingo tongues and ordinary Roman kitchen quietly invented one of the most comforting breakfasts the modern world still knows by heart, and never once got credit for it at the time. And maybe that is the gentlest way to end this particular journey together tonight. We spent all these hours walking through everything Rome considered the worst possible thing to put in your mouth. Fermented fish guts, a sweetener that hid real danger behind real sweetness, wombs and udders, and a herb loved directly into extinction, a spice once worth more than gold, a small creature fattened patiently in a jar, and enough imperial excess to fill several lifetimes over. We met a heavy, easygoing emperor who built a monument out of dinner and paid for it with his life. We sat with soldiers eating porridge by a campfire and a wealthy gourmet who could not imagine surviving on a fortune most people would consider more than enough for 10 lifetimes. We watched a fictional dinner party spiral into performance art and a real one turn into something considerably crueler. But underneath almost every single one of those stories sat the exact same quiet truth, the one thread running through all 12 tying a rotting fish sauce factory to a shower of flower petals to a plate of honeyed toast. What one century calls disgusting, another century simply calls dinner or medicine or love or Tuesday morning breakfast, depending entirely on how much distance and time happen to sit between the plate and the person judging it. Taste is never really permanent. It is inherited, defended, occasionally mocked, and eventually forgotten, only to quietly resurface centuries later, in a language, a symbol, a breakfast dish wearing a completely different name. Rome was never really so different from us sitting down each night to eat, to impress, to comfort ourselves, to survive. It just happened to write everything down and left the receipts lying around for us to eventually stumble across 2,000 years later, wondering with equal parts horror and affection what on earth they were thinking. Thank you truly for spending this long quiet stretch of the night here with me, walking through kitchens and banquet halls and battered old cookbooks that most people never think twice about before drifting off to sleep. I know how much of a strange, specific kind of trust it takes to let a stranger's voice keep you company for this many hours in the dark, and I do not take that lightly, not for a single minute of it. If any part of tonight helped your mind settle or gave you something strange and lovely to carry gently into sleep, a small fact to turn over quietly in the last few minutes before your thoughts finally go soft and slow, that is honestly the only thing I ever hoped for when I first sat down to put this story together. There are always more tables like this one waiting to be uncovered, more strange human little stories tucked quietly away in the historical record, dusty and half-forgotten, patient in the way only very old things can afford to be. Somewhere out there sits another shipwreck, another forgotten recipe, another emperor with a story worth telling gently in the dark to someone who has had a long day and simply needs somewhere soft to land for a while. I will be here when you're ready for the next one. Until then, rest well. Let your shoulders drop. Let the room go quiet. You have earned it. Good night.